In the oldest memory, the world still carries far older than poetry, older than temples, older even than the first word mortals shaped from breath and need. There was only the vast, dreaming dark of chaos. From that immeasurable nothingness rose the earliest powers, heavy with potential, drifting like half-formed thoughts across an endless void. It was in this unsteady beginning that Gaia, the earth, took her shape, a wide-breasted presence whose body became the land, the mountains, the nourishing soil, and from her came the deep rumble of Tartarus below, the fathomless pit where eternity seemed to look back at itself. Yet the last to emerge from chaos was a figure far more subtle, far more shadowed than the others. Night herself, Nyx, robed in an unbroken blackness that seemed to drink light and silence alike. These primordial beings formed the earliest architecture of existence, and from them came the first forces that would shape the fate of gods and mortals. But though Gaia and Uranus gave birth to the Titans, and the Titans would shape the order of the cosmos, there was a quieter lineage sprouting in the background, children of shadows and inevitability, children who belonged not to the brilliant expanse of the sky, nor the growing realm of form, but to the margins where light failed. Among them, eventually, came Hades. Though he was not born into the world in the same way the Titans had been, his lineage was neither purely of night nor purely of earth, but rather a descendant of the Titans Kronos and Rhea, a child conceived in an age when the Titans ruled with iron certainty. Yet what made Hades different was not his parentage, but the destiny waiting for him, one that reached back into the earliest shape of the world, toward the darkness that had existed long before gods had names. His beginning, however, was violent. When Kronos looked upon his children, he did not see sons and daughters. He saw threats. An ancient prophecy had once whispered that one of his own offspring would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father. Terrified, Kronos swallowed each child the moment it was born, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, and then Hades, consuming them whole as if by swallowing them he was swallowing time, sealing away change, chaining the future to his own will. Inside that strange, suffocating prison, Hades had no sense of his siblings, no awareness of the world outside. There was only pressure, darkness, and the muffled pulse of a god afraid of his own lineage. Yet this confinement, grim though it was, shaped Hades more profoundly than anything that came after. For while his brothers and sisters would later walk freely under the sky, basking in sunlight and triumph, Hades had tasted confinement long before he ever tasted power. He had learned the soft, unending weight of stillness, had become intimate with silence, had felt time stretch into something slow and heavy. And it was in that slow heaviness that something inside him understood a truth other gods would spend ages trying to grasp, that life, no matter how brilliantly lived, is always shadowed by endings, that every victory, every joy, every mighty age, even ages of gods, would one day fall into memory and then into dust. This understanding did not make him sorrowful. Rather, it made him steady. It carved out of him an inward calm, a patience deeper than the roots of mountains. In the cramped darkness of his father's stomach, Hades' nature quietly settled, preparing him for the realm he did not yet know he would one day command. When Zeus was finally born, hidden away by the desperate Rhea and raised in secret on Mount Ida, the world shifted toward rebellion. Zeus grew strong, clever, and brimming with the kind of defiance that could topple an age. When he forced Kronos to disgorge his swallowed siblings, Hades emerged blinking into a world that had moved on without him. The sky was brighter than anything he had ever imagined. The earth felt vast and strange. His siblings stood near him, disoriented and raw, their divine bodies still shimmering from long imprisonment. And though they were united in their rage against Kronos, Hades stood slightly apart, realizing that while the others felt reborn, he felt something different returned from confinement, returned from silence, returned from a place where endings were not an abstract idea but a lived experience. That was the first quiet rift between Hades and the others, though none of them yet understood it. Zeus looked upward, imagining thrones in the sky. Poseidon looked outward, seeing the oceans as a promise. But Hades? He looked downward, toward shadows pooled beneath stones, toward caves where cool air breathed from deep places, toward ravines that seemed to exhale ancient memory. He did not fully understand why those places called to him, only that they did. Yet before any of them could seek their destinies, there was a war to fight, one that would decide the shape of the cosmos. The Titanomachy erupted across existence like a storm. The Titans, towering and furious, fought to maintain their age. The young gods, fueled by new purpose and the thrill of inevitable change, fought to seize it. Hades marched beside his brothers into this world-shaking conflict, his heart steady, his expression calm even as mountains cracked and oceans boiled. Behind Zeus's thunderous wrath and Poseidon's surging power, Hades fought with a different kind of strength, a silent, relentless precision, a patience that kept him moving even as others faltered. But before the war had truly begun, the Cyclopes, grateful for their liberation from the Titans' brutal chains, gifted each Olympian brother a weapon. For Zeus, the thunderbolt; for Poseidon, the trident; and for Hades, something far quieter, far more dangerous, the helm of invisibility. Forged in a darkness deeper than even the belly of Kronos, the helm granted the wearer the power to slip into unseen places, to move like a shadow, to blind enemies with the terror of not knowing where death might come from. When Hades placed the helm upon his head for the first time, it felt less like wearing a weapon and more like stepping into a truth he had always known. The darkness wrapped around him like a second skin, cool and familiar, and for the first time he felt the clarity of purpose humming beneath his calm exterior. This helm was not merely a tool, it was an affirmation. The war burned across the world for 10 long years. Titans and gods clashed with a violence that reshaped continents, cracked open mountains, and carved chasms into the earth. The sky roared with Zeus's fury. The seas heaved under Poseidon's assaults. The Titans, towering and furious, fought to maintain their age. The young gods, fueled by new purpose and the thrill of inevitable change, fought to seize it. Hades marched beside his brothers into this world-shaking conflict, his heart steady, his expression calm even as mountains cracked and oceans boiled. And, beneath it all, Hades moved like a whisper of doom. Using his helm, he struck from shadows, slipping through ranks of Titans unnoticed, unraveling their strategies by eliminating their strongest leaders one by one. His precision terrified even immortal beings, for nothing is more frightening than an enemy one cannot see. But while his siblings exulted in every victory, Hades felt something different during the Titanomachy, a growing distance from the world above. War was loud. Triumph was simply the beginning of a new responsibility. After the Titanomachy, the brothers stood together over the newly restored earth, tired but resolute, ready to divide the cosmos so the world would not fall into chaos again. They drew lots, trusting to fate what their future roles would be. Zeus with the sky, Poseidon with the sea, and Hades, his lot, fell to the underworld. If Zeus celebrated and Poseidon grumbled, Hades simply nodded. For deep inside, he had already known. The underworld was not a punishment. It was not even exile. It was the natural endpoint of the calm that had always lived in him. A realm of stillness, of inevitability, of memory. It was the place where souls drifted after their brief brilliance above. It was the place where the oldest truths settled like sediment. He accepted his role without protest, stepping into the vast, dark realm below the earth with quiet purpose. As he descended into his new dominion for the first time, the path felt eerily familiar, as though some distant memory was guiding his steps. The underworld welcomed him not with celebration but with silence. Rivers flowed in black ribbons through shadowed caverns. The air hummed with the faint rustle of souls not yet born. Ancient currents of power wound around him like soft chains, acknowledging him, binding him, inviting him, and Hades, who had once been swallowed into darkness against his will, now stepped into it willingly, even gratefully. For down here, in this realm where endings breathed like gentle winds, where silence was not emptiness but presence, where shadows held stories waiting to be told, Hades felt something he had never felt under the sky. War against the Titans. The war that reshaped eternity did not begin with a single clash or a single cry. It began with a shifting in the air, a tightening in the world's pulse, as if the very fabric of existence sensed that an old order was fracturing. The Titans had ruled for ages, their dominion long and heavy, stretching across sky, sea, and earth, with a grip that seemed unbreakable. Yet the moment Kronos' children spilled back into the world, grown, angry, and aware of the prophecy that doomed their father, the balance trembled. And tremble became strain, strain became rupture, and rupture erupted into a cataclysm that would reverberate for all time. Hades stood beside Zeus and Poseidon in the earliest days of the Titanomachy, silent, watchful, absorbing the shape of the war before it fully took form. Massive storms swirled across the young earth. Mountains shuddered as though preparing to uproot themselves. The sky carried a color not seen since the world first opened its eyes. The Titans gathered on towering ridges, their bodies vast enough to cast continent-long shadows. They were beings forged in the earliest fires, their breath older than oceans, their strength untested for ages. For the first time, they prepared for resistance. Zeus hurled lightning into the sky, declaring his rebellion openly. Poseidon churned the sea until waves rose like walls. But Hades remained still a moment longer, fingers brushing the helm of darkness he had scarcely begun to understand. While his brothers wielded raw force, Hades studied the battlefield with a mind sharpened by years of living in the confined quiet of Kronos' belly. He saw patterns, saw weaknesses, saw that winning a war was rarely about being the loudest force, it was about being the unseen one. When the first true clash came, it shook the world with such ferocity that whole valleys split open. Titans met the younger gods with roars that collapsed cliffs. Lightning carved glowing scars across the heavens. Poseidon's trident shattered stone giants summoned by Hyperion. Zeus blinded mountainsides with radiance that pierced even divine eyes. But for all their power, the young gods were fewer in number and far less experienced. The Titans fought with the heavy certainty of age, with the arrogance of those who had never feared defeat. Yet the young gods had allies the Titans had underestimated. From the bowels of Tartarus, the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires emerged immense creatures whom the Titans had imprisoned for ages. Freed by Zeus's defiance, they now owed allegiance to the new generation. The Cyclopes forged weapons that changed the course of battle. Zeus's thunderbolt, Poseidon's trident, and Hades' helm. The Hecatoncheires, with their 100 arms and mountainous size, hurled boulders the size of city-states, turning battlefields into storms of stone. Their presence tilted the war's balance, yet the Titans were far from broken. On the blood-stained plains of Thessaly, the war ground forward with a ruthlessness that eroded years into dust. Hades vanished beneath his helmet again and again, slipping through the battlefield like a fragment of night cut free from the sky. Titans, who once commanded storms, felt sudden cold hands upon their throats. Giants found their legs pulled from under them by invisible force. Commanders were struck down without seeing their attacker. Fear began creeping into Titan ranks, not fear of thunder, not fear of oceans, but fear of the unseen. Even in the chaos of war, they whispered of a shadow that killed without warning. Yet Hades did not revel in fear. He moved with the same calm that had steadied him in confinement. His blows were deliberate, his choices precise, his movements almost meditative. But each kill struck him differently than it did Zeus or Poseidon. For them, victory was exhilaration. For Hades, it felt like the world's natural shape revealing itself. Every titan who fell reminded him that all things, even beings older than mountains, would one day meet their end. In that truth, he found an unshakable steadiness. Still, the war was no straightforward path. The Titans rallied around Atlas, whose strength seemed to hold the sky itself on his shoulders. He led charges that forced the younger gods into retreat more than once. Krios summoned storms of black fire that scorched entire armies. Iapetus unleashed weapons forged in the earliest moments of creation, spears tipped with fragments of the first star. Even Kronos, slipping between ages as easily as others stepped across stones, fought with a fury born of desperation. His scythe tore open fissures in the land, each swing carving rifts that glowed with ancient radiance. During the fourth year of the war, the young gods found themselves cornered in the foothills of Mount Othrys, the stronghold of the Titans. Zeus's lightning grew weaker, Poseidon's strength faltered as he fought far from the sea. Hera and Demeter struggled to shield mortals and nymphs caught in the war's wake. Hades alone felt neither exhaustion nor fear, but even calm could not overcome numbers. The Titans pressed downward like an avalanche, and the Olympians braced for the strike that would end their rebellion. But Hades, cloaked in shadow, had already slipped behind enemy lines. He reached the cavern where the Cyclopes were once imprisoned, a place still thick with chains and old suffering. Drawing upon the helm's power, he turned invisible not only in form, but in presence, becoming something deeper than absence. He moved among the Titans guarding the cavern, striking swiftly, leaving no echo of his passing. Once inside, he tore apart the remaining restraints with strength born not of rage, but of quiet inevitability. The Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires, furious from memories of torment, surged upward, roaring as they smashed into Titan ranks with unstoppable force. That moment turned the tide. The Titans faltered under the sudden onslaught. Zeus regained his footing, lightning exploding from him with renewed ferocity. Poseidon tore rivers from nearby cliffs and sent them crashing through enemy ranks. Hades slipped between Titans like a phantom, striking precisely at joints, throats, and hearts. The battlefield transformed from a suffocating trap into a path toward victory. Still, the Titans were not finished. On the 8th year of war, Kronos unleashed a technique older than gods. He bent time itself. Olympian soldiers froze mid-stride. Rivers held still in their beds. Even Zeus stumbled as Kronos' mastery of time wrapped around him. The Titans surged forward, time twisting like a storm around their king. Hades watched as moments fragmented, 1 second stretched into 10, then collapsed into nothing. Yet beneath the distortion, he felt something familiar, the pressure of confined space, the endless heaviness, the slow, suffocating drag of time stretched too thin. It reminded him of Kronos' stomach. That memory became his anchor. While others floundered, Hades steadied himself, letting the weight of his past guide him. He slipped the helm over his head and walked into the distorted space Kronos had created. Time slowed around him, but he moved not by resisting it, but by accepting it. Kronos sensed something wrong, an emptiness where a presence should be, and in that instant of uncertainty, Hades struck. His blade pierced the flow of time itself, shattering Kronos' concentration. The distortion collapsed. The world snapped back into motion. Zeus hurled a thunderbolt that sent Kronos staggering. Poseidon drove his trident into the earth, knocking Titans off balance. The war lurched back toward the younger gods. But even then, ending the Titanomachy required more than strength. It required resolve. On the final day of battle, the gods fought on the slopes of Othrys itself. The mountain groaned under the weight of conflict, its peaks cracking, its valleys collapsing. Titans clashed with Cyclopes. Giants roared as Hecatoncheires tore them apart. Zeus and Kronos battled at the summit, lightning and time clashing in bursts that blinded even immortals. Poseidon flooded lower slopes with surging currents. Hera shielded wounded soldiers with shimmering barriers. Demeter steadied the trembling earth so it would not swallow entire armies. And Hades vanished. He moved unseen to Kronos' blind spot, where time faltered from overuse. He stepped into the slowing air with the poise of a judge entering a silent courtroom. Kronos sensed him too late. Hades' strike did not kill Kronos, was too old, too vast for death in the mortal sense, but it broke his stance, shattered the last thread of his defense. Zeus, seeing the opening, unleashed a thunderbolt that struck Kronos square in the chest. The force hurled him backward, collapsing the summit. The war was over. The Titans, weakened and dazed, were bound in chains forged by the Cyclopes chains that glowed with power from the earliest fires. One by one, they were cast into Tartarus, sealed away so deeply that no age of gods or mortals would hear from them again. Atlas alone suffered a different punishment, forced to hold the sky on his shoulders for all eternity. As the world quieted, Zeus looked over the battlefield with triumph. Poseidon exhaled with relief, but Hades stood upon the cracked earth, gazing not at victory but at the cost. Fallen giants lay scattered like mountains broken apart. Mortals who had fought beside the gods slept forever among shattered cliffs. Rivers ran red where war had touched them. The world, though saved, bore wounds that would take centuries to forget. Yet Hades did not mourn the fallen with despair. Instead, he felt a calling awaken a responsibility older than war, older even than prophecy. For when he looked upon the battlefield, he saw not tragedy, but transition. Each fallen life whispered of an ending, and endings required a keeper. It was then, before the lots were drawn, before he ever descended into the underworld, that Hades first understood the shape of his destiny. Not as a punishment, not as exile, but as the only role he had ever been meant to hold. The war had shown the world that life burned brightly, but it had also revealed the quiet truth behind all brightness. All things must pass, and Hades would become the one who guided what remained. The division of the cosmos. When the dust of war finally settled upon the wounded earth, a stillness spread across the world so profound that even the gods paused to feel it. Mountains that had cracked beneath colossal blows now stood frozen in jagged silence. Rivers churned weakly through channels carved by battle's fury. The sky, once ripped open by lightning and time itself, hung heavy with a muted, exhausted glow. The Titanomachy had ended, leaving behind a world that required healing and gods who needed new purpose. The victory was real, yet nothing about it felt celebratory. It felt inevitable, like the ending of a season whose final days had long been foretold. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades stood together on a high ridge overlooking the plain of Thessaly, where the last shouts of war had faded only hours before. Behind them stretched the remnants of their army, immortals battered, mortals trembling, nymphs and spirits drifting like ghosts through smoke and broken stone. The Cyclopes rested with weapons still glowing faintly from the heat of forging divine power. The Hecatoncheires crouched like mountains come alive, their many arms hanging limp with exhaustion. No one spoke, for the world itself seemed to forbid noise until the gods themselves understood what must come next. The division of the cosmos. When the dust of war finally settled upon the wounded earth, a stillness spread across the world so profound that even the gods paused to feel it. Mountains that had cracked beneath colossal blows now stood frozen in jagged silence. Rivers churned weakly through channels carved by battle's fury. The sky, once ripped open by lightning and time itself, hung heavy with a muted, exhausted glow. The Titanomachy had ended, leaving behind a world that required healing and gods who needed new purpose. The victory was real, yet nothing about it felt celebratory. It felt inevitable, like the ending of a season whose final days had long been foretold. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades stood together on a high ridge overlooking the plain of Thessaly, where the last shouts of war had faded only hours before. The Titans had been thrown into Tartarus, sealed beneath layers of stone and divine chains. Kronos, stripped of his scythe and shattered by the force of the final blow, had been dragged into the abyss with a quiet that unsettled even his conquerors. For though Zeus's victory was total, the shadow of the prophecy lingered in the air like a faint echo. The old age had ended. A new age waited to be shaped. The war had carved truths into him, truths that whispered beneath his steady breath every time he glanced at the fallen. An era had died, and death required order. It was Zeus who first broke the silence. His eyes, still glowing faintly with bolts not yet spent, swept across the ravaged landscape. "The world must be rebuilt," he said, his voice carrying both authority and the weariness of battle. "The balance restored. Chaos must not fill the space our father once held." Poseidon nodded. Thus, it was decided that the division of the cosmos must fall to fate itself. Zeus called upon the Cyclopes, who brought forth an urn carved from the stone of the earth's earliest bones. The urn pulsed faintly with primordial energy, fashioned in a time before the Titans, before order, before even memory. Into this vessel were placed 3 lots, 3 fates waiting to be drawn by the very beings who would shape the next age. The sky, the sea, the realm beneath. As the urn was set before them, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Zeus reached first, as was expected of him, his hand closing around a slip of destiny. He unfolded it slowly, and the sky crackled with recognition. He had drawn the heavens. Poseidon stepped forward next, dipping his hand into the urn. When he withdrew the lot that shimmered with blue-green power, the ocean rippled in answer. The sea was his. That left the final slip untouched. Hades stepped to the urn, though he already knew. The weight of the last lot felt familiar even before he opened it, and when he did, a soft tremor passed through the world, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth the cosmos itself had chosen. He would rule the underworld. There was no gasp from the assembled gods, no murmuring, no surprise. The realm below, the place where all life's songs eventually fell silent, was not a gift others coveted. To many, it seemed bleak, an eternal kingdom of shadow, removed from the glories of sky and sea. To Zeus, the heavens offered power. To Poseidon, the sea promised dominion. But Hades, upon reading his fate, did not frown nor hesitate. Instead, a deep calm washed through him, as if the lot had merely confirmed something written within him long before he had ever drawn breath. He looked downward, not toward defeat, but toward duty. For if Zeus would govern storms and Poseidon the tides, someone must guide the currents of life's endings. Someone must hold the last gate, tend the silent roads, listen to the whispers of countless souls drifting from the mortal world. Someone must ensure that death, inevitable and impartial, remained a force of balance rather than chaos. That role fit Hades the way sky fit Zeus and sea fit Poseidon, not by preference, but by truth. When the division was complete, the brothers clasped arms not as rivals but as pillars of a new age. They promised to support one another, to uphold order, to guide mortals and immortals alike. And yet, even in that unity, their paths diverged. Zeus gazed upward, already imagining palaces among the clouds. Poseidon looked toward distant horizons, feeling the sea calling him home. Hades did not gaze toward sky or sea. He closed his eyes, sensing the dim pulse of a realm waiting for him. The journey to the underworld began alone. He descended through caverns carved long before gods existed, following pathways that spiraled deep into the marrow of the earth. The deeper he went, the cooler the air grew, like a long exhale from a sleeping giant. Shadows stretched as though reaching to greet him. Stone walls glimmered faintly with minerals that hummed ancient songs. At last he reached a vast chasm, where a river of dark water flowed silently between jagged shores. This river had existed since the first creature drew breath, a boundary between life and its aftermath. Its name whispered itself into his mind. Styx. She rose before him, the river's spirit, towering and severe. Rigid loyalty radiated from her like frozen air. She spoke no words. She simply bowed her head, recognizing her king. Hades stepped into her waters, unafraid, and crossed to the other side where the underworld stretched before him like a continent of shadowed possibility. He found not emptiness, but potential. Caverns the size of cities, rivers that glowed with memory, ridges where the dead would one day gather like drifting clouds. The air carried whispers that were not voices but impressions, fleeting remnants of lives yet to come. There was no cruelty in this place, no malice, only neutrality, the calm presence of what waits at the end of all things. Hades moved through the realm slowly, feeling its shape as one might trace the outline of a future home. Each step echoed softly, the sound swallowed by the vastness. He realized then that the underworld would not be a prison, nor an exile, nor a place of eternal gloom. It would be a kingdom not above, but below, not loud, but ordered, not radiant, but essential. Here he could build something no god had ever shaped before, a structured afterlife, a world where every soul found its path. He would place judges at the gates. He would raise a palace from the stone. He would carve rivers with purpose. He would create the balance that life itself demanded. He felt no envy for his brothers, no longing for skies or seas. His realm was deeper than either, older in feeling than both. And while Zeus would battle storms and Poseidon waves, Hades would rule something far more enduring. For kingdoms rise and fall, empires bloom and crumble, generations thrive and fade. But the underworld endures. As he stood upon a high ledge, overlooking the silent expanse of his new dominion, Hades let the enormity of his role settle into him. Above, the world churned with life, vibrant and chaotic. Below, the world waited in stillness, ready to receive the echoes of all that life would create. And he, Hades, born in shadows, shaped by confinement, honed by war, now stood poised to become the bridge between existence and its conclusion. He breathed in the cool air of the underworld and felt something close to belonging, not joy, not relief, but a steady sense of rightness, a matching of being to purpose that few immortals ever found. The division of the cosmos had not only assigned realms, it had revealed truths. Zeus was the bright force of command, Poseidon the restless pulse of nature, but Hades was the quiet certainty underlying both the inevitable end, the patient keeper, the judge of what no one else wished to face. And so, without fanfare or thunder, Hades began the work of shaping his kingdom, a kingdom not built on light or storm, but on the profound calm of endings, a kingdom that would outlast even the gods who ruled it. For while life rises in brilliance, it is the underworld that receives every story the world will ever tell, building the realm of shades. In the deep silence of the newly designated underworld, Hades stood upon a plateau of ancient stone, the air heavy with a stillness untouched by time. This was no palace, no grand seat of power, just a raw, unshaped expanse stretching into black horizons, a realm waiting for order, a world suspended between being and non-being, filled with the quiet hum of potential. And Hades, who had spent the early years of his existence confined in darkness, who had fought a war of shadows and precision, who had known endings long before he knew beginnings, felt something akin to purpose rise within him. He inhaled, the breath steady and cool in his chest. The underworld breathed back. It was not the breath of sky or sea, full of motion and life. It was the breath of stone and still water, of cavernous patience, of deep time. As Hades looked across his new dominion, He began to understand that this place would require more than authority. It would require creation, structure, intention. The souls of mortals would someday pour into this realm in unending streams. Without order, they would drift lost forever, turning the underworld into chaos. And Hades, whose nature had always leaned toward control and quiet purpose, would not permit that. Thus began the great shaping. The first task was carving the pathways, the routes by which souls would enter, be judged, and journey to their final resting places. There needed to be boundaries and channels, borders and currents. The underworld was vast, too vast for wandering spirits to navigate without guidance. So Hades walked its breadth, marking the shape of what would come. From his footsteps, fissures formed. From his gaze, rivers carved themselves. From his will, the skeletal framework of a kingdom emerged. The rivers came first, 5 channels of power, each carrying a different essence of mortality. The Styx, already flowing faintly through the darkness, deepened as he approached. Its waters, black as obsidian, glimmered with faint, luminous streaks, oaths made, broken, reforged. Styx herself rose from the river as a towering figure of stern composure, her gaze unwavering. She bowed to Hades, and her river stretched outward like a great boundary, circling the underworld with absolute command. This would be the river of unbreakable vows, of divine binding, its waters harsh enough to punish even gods. When mortals dipped their hands into its currents after death, they felt the weight of every promise they had made. Next came Acheron, the river of sorrow. It was born from the dim places where the underworld touched mortal grief. As Hades passed his hand through empty air, mist pooled at his feet, thickening until a river surged forth. Its waters were dark, not with malice but with mourning. Here would arrive the souls who died with burdens unspoken, their tears draining into the river's depth. Acheron flowed gently, offering a soft lamentation that echoed through the cavern walls like a memory whispered before sleep. Then, from the fissure beneath Hades' feet, rose Phlegethon, the river of fire. Its flames glowed red gold, but they did not burn in the mortal sense. They purified, they scoured, they dissolved hatred and rage, reducing even violent spirits to their core essence. Hades stood over it and watched as molten currents wound through the realm like veins of smouldering ember. It was a dangerous river, but necessary. Some souls needed cleansing before they could rest. Third to manifest was Lethe. A pale glow spilled from a crack in the stone, and a soft, quiet river formed, its waters shimmering with silver forgetfulness. Hades dipped a hand into it, and for a moment, memories flickered at the edge of nothingness. This river was mercy. Here, the weary could drink and forget the weight of their mortal pain. It would become the river of rest, its waters easing souls into peace. Last came Cocytus, the river of lamentation. Unlike Acheron's soft sorrow, Cocytus bore the sharper edge of despair. Its icy waters vibrated with the wails of souls unwilling to accept their fates. Stillness froze upon its banks, and the air turned crisp with the bitterness of unfulfilled desires. Hades listened to its first cry echo through the cavern and knew it was necessary. Some beings carried grief too deep to release. Cocytus would hold them. With the 5 rivers flowing, the underworld gained shape, a lattice of emotion and memory, order and necessity. Now the souls would have pathways, currents, to guide them, but they still needed direction, law, judgment, purpose. Thus came the judges of the dead. Hades knew he could not oversee every soul personally. He had seen, in the war, how countless beings could fall within a single heartbeat. Mortals, unlike gods, would die endlessly, their lives spiraling through time too quickly for any single being to monitor. He needed structure, beings of wisdom and impartiality. 3 mortal kings from ancient ages were brought to him, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. They had once ruled with fairness, their reputations echoing even after death. Hades saw in them the precision he required. He bestowed upon them eternal authority, not as rulers, but as judges. They would sit at the crossroads of the underworld, weighing the lives of each arriving soul, assigning them to the realm they merited. Rhadamanthus would judge the eastern mortals, those ruled by logic, discipline, and honor. Aeacus would measure those of the western lands, souls shaped by loyalty, craft, and community. And Minos, grave and contemplative, would cast the final vote when decisions grew heavy with complexity. Their thrones rose from stone, carved by the underworld itself. They did not need palaces. Their authority was not one of grandeur, but necessity. Next, Hades shaped the realms to which souls would be sent. To the far reaches of the underworld, where shadows thinned into cool twilight, he created the Asphodel Meadows, a vast expanse of soft, waving grasses, pale as moonlight, where ordinary souls, neither virtuous nor wicked, could wander without torment. Here, memories dimmed but did not vanish. Happiness softened but did not burn. Existence became gentle, a quiet echo instead of a punishment. For the virtuous, he carved the Elysian fields. This was no single field, but a series of interconnected paradises, golden plains, soft breezes, trees heavy with fruit, rivers warm and crystalline. A place where those who had lived with honor and courage could exist in peace. Over time, the elect would arise mortals who, through extraordinary virtue, achieved a place among the eternally reborn. For them, Elysium became even more serene, a realm where souls could choose to live again, endlessly striving toward deeper purity. And for the wicked, those whose cruelty had stained their souls beyond repentance, he created Tartarus, not the original prison of the Titans, but a deeper extension, a labyrinth of torment befitting their deeds. Here the Furies would enact judgment, ensuring that such souls did not re-enter the cycle of life corrupted. It was not vengeance. Hades had no hunger for cruelty. It was consequence. But even a realm of consequence needed guardians. Cerberus came next. Hades had not summoned him. Cerberus simply appeared, rising from the shadows as if the underworld itself had grown a protector. Massive, three-headed, each head bearing a different temperament, one snarling and ferocious, one calm and observant, one restless and alert. His tail writhed like a serpent, sensing the lies of those who approached. His paws struck sparks upon the stone. When he saw Hades, Cerberus bowed, three heads lowering in perfect synchronicity. He became the gatekeeper, ensuring that the living never sneaked inside and the dead never wandered out. The Furies Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone emerged soon after. Born from the blood of Uranus long before the Olympians, they belonged here, to the rawest truths of suffering and justice. Their wings beat softly as they circled Hades, understanding his need before he spoke it. They would enforce oaths, punish the corrupted, track down souls who tried to flee judgment. Their presence was terrifying, yet perfectly suited to the architecture of consequence. Hades shaped the palace afterward, not of gold or marble, not a gleaming monument like Zeus's throne atop Olympus. His palace grew from the stone itself, obsidian pillars rising like the roots of the world, vaulted ceilings reflecting dim echoes of distant light, quiet corridors where the walls hummed with memory. It was neither grand nor horrific. It was functional, ordered, calm, a place fit for a king whose realm required steadiness, not spectacle. As he walked its halls, Hades felt a strange sense of recognition, as though he had carried the blueprint of this palace inside him since birth. Here he could judge without distraction. Here he could oversee the flow of souls, the operations of rivers, the decisions of the judges. Here he could maintain balance, not just for his realm, but for the world above. For death was not an end, it was a necessary frontier. Without it, mortality would overflow, generations stacking upon one another without meaning. Without endings, beginnings would lose their shape. So, Hades continued shaping. He brought forth Nyx, the primordial night, to cast a cloak over the edges of the underworld, ensuring no mortal eyes could glimpse its depth without permission. He invited Hypnos, the god of sleep, to build his abode near Lethe's banks, allowing dreams to drift between realms when needed. Thanatos, gentle death, became his emissary, soft-footed and calm, carrying souls to the underworld with kindness rather than cruelty. Each figure found a place in the architecture of Hades' realm, not as subjects but as extensions of necessity. The underworld became not a pit but a system, intricate, balanced, deliberate, a world beneath the world, as essential as breath itself. And through it all, Hades moved with the same quiet resolve that had always defined him. He did not boast of his accomplishments. He did not parade his authority. He simply built, step by step, until the underworld no longer resembled a void, but a kingdom, magnificent in its stillness, complex in its order, eternal in its purpose. Above, Zeus shaped laws and storms. Poseidon sculpted tides and caverns. Mortals began to rebuild lands scarred by the Titanomachy. But it was Hades who created the structure that would hold every mortal life after its final breath. Hades who ensured that death would not be chaos. Hades who understood that endings required as much craftsmanship as beginnings. He did not need sunlight to feel fulfilled. He needed order. He needed purpose. He needed the quiet where truth could settle. And in the heart of the underworld, surrounded by the rivers he had drawn and the laws he had shaped, Hades finally felt what none of the other gods could claim. He felt completely, profoundly at peace. The rise of the underworld kingship. Hades walked the length of his realm in the early ages, moving through corridors of stone, still settling into shape, across plains where the newly formed grasses of asphodel swayed without wind, and along river banks where currents whispered of the countless souls that would one day pass through them. In those first years, the underworld was structured but quiet, ordered but empty. It was a kingdom without subjects, a system without the flow it was designed to manage. Yet the silence never unnerved him. It simply allowed him to refine the boundaries, strengthen the channels, and reinforce the laws that would govern all who entered. The earlier souls drifted in slowly. They came from small human tribes scattered across the mortal world, people whose lives had been shaped by hunt and fire, by the fragile balance of survival. When the first mortal died after the Titanomachy, the soul hesitated at the boundary of the world above, unsure of its path. Thanatos, obedient to the new balance, guided it downward, and the old man entered the underworld with the same uncertain steps as a traveler approaching a foreign land. Hades observed the moment from a distance, noting how the soul followed the river currents instinctively, its form faint and translucent. It felt no fear, only confusion. The underworld received it without resistance. That first arrival signaled the beginning of countless more. As human settlements grew across valleys and coastlines, as generations lived and died, the underworld shifted into motion. The halls that once echoed only with the slow seep of water now carried the faint murmurs of souls. The judges took their roles without hesitation, seating themselves at the stone tribunal that overlooked the entry passages. Minos's expression settled into stern concentration. Rhadamanthus analyzed each life as though weighing the logic of an argument. Aeacus's decisions were measured with the fairness of one who had once built cities stone by stone. Together, they created a rhythm, a steady procession of judgment that gave structure to the arrival of each spirit. Hades watched the judges for many years to ensure their work remained impartial. They understood the weight of the task, not to grant reward or punishment based on emotion, but to classify each soul according to the life it had lived. The accuracy of their decisions became the foundation of the underworld's functioning. Elysium slowly grew in population, while the meadows of asphodel filled with those who had lived ordinary lives. Tartarus remained sparse in the beginning, its shadows quiet except for the echo of the Titan's distant confinement. Over time, however, as human societies developed laws, ambitions, and conflicts, more souls found their way to Tartarus, not through random cruelty, but through deliberate harm in the mortal world. For Hades, establishing this system was only one part of his responsibility. The other part involved maintaining the balance between realms. Mortals feared death deeply, and that fear shaped their rituals. They left offerings at burial sites, whispered prayers toward caves believed to reach the underworld, and invented stories to explain what happened after the final breath. Hades paid attention to these beliefs, not to encourage devotion. He had no interest in worship, but to understand how mortals interpreted the boundaries of life. Their perceptions influenced how souls arrived. Rituals became a practical link between the worlds. As people began burying their dead with tokens, tools, and small vessels of food, Hades noted how the souls who arrived with such items carried faint impressions of them, shadows of the physical offerings. These impressions caused no disruption, but they revealed how deeply mortal belief could imprint itself upon the process of death. In response, Hades strengthened the role of Lethe, ensuring that memories faded gradually so that souls did not cling too tightly to the lives they had left. It was not cruelty, it was necessity. A soul that refused to release the mortal world could not settle. As civilizations advanced, so too did the underworld's complexity. The growth of cities, agriculture, and organized societies created larger populations and more frequent deaths. Wars erupted between emerging kingdoms, sending sudden floods of souls downward. During these times, Hades observed an imbalance, not in numbers, but in the nature of the arrivals. Soldiers often died carrying fear, confusion, or the last rush of adrenaline. Their spirits were more restless. Lethe became essential for them, calming the remnants of conflict. Thanatos guided them gently, ensuring that violent ends did not translate into violent unrest below. As the realm continued to settle into its intended rhythm, Hades faced another challenge: boundaries. The living, curious about what lay beyond their final breath, sought ways to glimpse the underworld. Some approached through dreams, others ventured into deep caverns. Still others, seers and shamans, claimed to speak with the dead. Hades did not forbid such contact. He watched it with careful scrutiny. When the dead were called too frequently or without purpose, he reinforced the natural barriers, allowing only faint echoes to rise, never full manifestations. The underworld was meant to be separate, not erased from mortal understanding, but shielded from careless intrusion. As centuries passed, the underworld gained its own internal culture, not through autonomy, but through the patterns of its inhabitants. Souls in Asphodel walked paths worn by countless footsteps. Elysian residents found quiet companionship among those who shared virtues from distant lifetimes. The elect began to emerge, souls who sought purity beyond reward, requesting rebirth to strive toward even higher ideals. The concept of reincarnation took shape organically, not as a law but as an option for the rare spirit who desired it. Hades permitted it under strict conditions, allowing no soul to return until its past was fully washed clean by Lethe. The palace also changed over time. Though still austere, it expanded to accommodate new functions. A hall for treaties took shape, where Hypnos could discuss matters of influence between sleep and death. A quiet wing formed where the Furies delivered their reports. Cerberus's resting chamber grew near the entrance passage, ensuring he could guard the gates without strain. None of these changes made the palace grand, but they made it functional. The Furies, relentless and unyielding, enforced the laws of the underworld with precision. When a mortal committed acts that disrupted natural balance, such as violating sacred oaths or shedding innocent blood, the Furies emerged to restore equilibrium. Though feared by both gods and mortals, their actions were guided not by wrath but by the structure Hades had built. They answered directly to him, and he ensured their judgments aligned with the larger system he maintained. As the flow of souls increased, Hades also began shaping the geography further. He formed distinct caverns where particularly burdened spirits could rest undisturbed. He carved a quiet region where children's souls lingered gently, untouched by judgment, shielded from fear. He refined the borders of Tartarus so that the punishments within reflected not mere suffering but the permanence of consequence. These adjustments created more stability, preventing overcrowding or confusion among the dead. His work did not go unnoticed. The gods on Olympus saw the underworld as distant and somber, but they respected its order. They understood, even if they rarely admitted it, that their dominion relied on the structure Hades maintained. Without the underworld functioning smoothly, life itself would lose meaning. Mortals would refuse risk without consequence. Kingdoms would expand without limit. Even divine affairs would falter if the dead could not be contained or guided. The system that Hades built carried the weight of the entire world. In time, the underworld established a rhythm so steady that even the gods grew accustomed to its presence. Zeus ruled the sky with authority. Poseidon shaped the seas with restless energy, and Hades governed the realm below with quiet consistency. The balance among the brothers was not always harmonious, but it was stable. Each realm influenced the others. Droughts required death. Storms swept away lives that would journey downward. Fertile seasons brought new generations that would eventually find their way to Hades' gates. This interconnectedness became, for Hades, a long-term responsibility, one that extended far beyond ruling. He monitored the changes in the mortal world, not to influence them, but to anticipate their consequences. A famine in one region would mean an influx of weakened souls. A thriving city would send generations downward over centuries. Great migrations altered the cultural impressions that souls carried with them. Hades observed all of this calmly, adjusting the underworld accordingly. The realm itself responded to him. When he walked its corridors, torches lit without flame. When he approached the rivers, their currents steadied. When he entered the chambers of judgment, the stone thrones shifted faintly, as if acknowledging his presence. The underworld was not alive in the mortal sense, but it was connected to him, shaped by his intention. In these early ages, Hades did not think of himself as a king in the Olympian sense. He did not sit upon a throne issuing declarations. His authority came from the structure he established, the laws he upheld, the balance he maintained. He ruled not by power but by necessity. And as centuries stretched into millennia, the underworld transformed into a functioning world, stable, predictable, enduring. Souls arrived, were judged, settled, and became part of the quiet rhythm that echoed through the realm. The rivers flowed without interruption. The judges ruled with consistency, the Furies enforced with precision. Cerberus guarded with unwavering vigilance. Persephone's fate unfolds. In the long ages after the Titanomachy and the establishment of the underworld's enduring order, Hades ruled with steadiness, patience, and an unwavering commitment to structure. His realm functioned like a carefully engineered mechanism, every river, judge, boundary, and corridor performing its role without excess or deficiency. Yet as centuries passed, Hades began to sense something in the world above that the underworld could not replicate. An unpredictable vitality, a shifting brightness, a current of growth untouched by the stillness of his domain. It was not something he desired for himself, but rather something he recognized as a fundamental force shaping mortality. That force had a name: Persephone. Her existence first stirred the underworld's notice long before she ever set foot near its borders. Born to Demeter and Zeus, Persephone grew beneath the canopy of the world's forests, surrounded by the quiet rush of leaves and the cycle of blooming fields. Demeter's influence fostered abundance across the mortal world. Fields flourished, rivers ran clear, and crops rose in generous waves. Wherever Persephone walked, blossoms opened, vines curled upward, and light took on the color of early spring. Her presence was not overwhelming. It was subtle, a shift in the world's breath, but unmistakable to those who sensed the rhythm's underlying existence. Hades did not seek her. He did not gaze upward longing for companionship. His realm demanded constant attention, and solitude never pressed upon him as a burden. But the forces that shaped the cosmos had a way of intersecting, even when intentions did not align with outcomes. When Hades first perceived Persephone, it was not through sight but through the residual impressions carried by the souls descending into his realm. Mortals spoke of a maiden who brought warmth to cold valleys, who coaxed green shoots from barren hillsides, who walked with a calm grace that allowed children and elders alike to approach her without fear. Her presence was gentle, yet distinctive enough to filter through memory even after death. Hades did not consider her further at that time. The underworld remained his focus, and the mortal world's affairs belonged to those who ruled above ground. But the impressions persisted through the centuries, growing clearer as Persephone matured. She became a figure who fascinated not through power. Many gods possessed greater strength, but through her quiet influence on the seasons. The world responded to her in subtle but far-reaching ways. Hades, who understood the long, unbroken cycles of life and death, took note of these patterns with increasing frequency. The turning point came when the mortal realm began to experience a shift in its harvest patterns. Demeter's influence had always ensured steady agricultural cycles, but as Persephone grew, those cycles became more pronounced, more vibrant, more harmonious. Hades observed this indirectly. The souls arriving at his gates expressed gratitude for abundant harvests, or relief from once predictable droughts. Farmers lived longer in regions touched by Persephone's presence, and communities prospered. Mortals spoke of her with reverence, though they never worshipped her in fear. She inspired appreciation rather than awe. Hades did not interpret these changes as a sign or omen. Instead, he treated them as developments in the broader system of life, a reminder that the balance among gods shaped mortal experiences in complex ways. Still, with each passing century, Persephone's presence became woven deeper into the world's rhythm. Her steps coincided with the return of warmth after winter. Her laughter, rarely heard by mortals, except as a faint echo carried on wind, coincided with the emergence of early flowers. She did not command these phenomena. They happened around her. The underworld itself seemed to sense the growing importance of her presence above. The river Lethe flowed with unusual clarity during these ages, as if the world's cycles of growth softened the burdens carried by the newly dead. The meadows of Asphodel seemed to sway more rhythmically, and even the groves near Elysium held a subtle brightness. These were faint changes, barely noticeable, unless one observed the realm with meticulous attention. But Hades noticed them. His realm, bound by its own internal logic, nonetheless remained connected to the natural world through the cycles that fed it. Persephone was becoming a central thread in that cycle. As centuries continued, Persephone entered adolescence, and Demeter's protective instincts intensified. Demeter kept her daughter close, guarding her from the unpredictable influences of gods and mortals alike. She taught Persephone to understand the land, to sense the fragile balance that governed plant and soil, to recognize how even storms served a purpose. Persephone absorbed these teachings with a patience that mirrored Hades' own, though they never met. She grew into a figure who embodied the transition seasons, neither wholly spring nor fully summer, but something that bridged the two with quiet continuity. The first time Hades saw her was neither planned nor deliberate. He had risen to the mortal surface to address a matter involving an ancient fissure between realms. A chasm had opened in a remote highland, allowing restless spirits to slip upward and confuse a nearby village. Hades traveled to investigate, accompanied by no heralds or attendants. His presence above ground was a rare event, undertaken only when the stability of the boundary demanded personal intervention. He walked through a valley lined with weathered stones, the air carrying the faint scent of aromatic herbs. As he approached the region where the fissure had opened, Hades noticed that the land itself had changed. What should have been a barren slope was instead covered in wildflowers. Vines climbed over rocks that had been bare for centuries. In the distance, he heard the soft sound of laughter, light enough to blend with the wind, yet distinct enough to draw his attention. He saw Persephone standing among the flowers, gathering blossoms with movements so unhurried they appeared almost suspended in time. She did not see him. Her focus remained on the petals she examined, each chosen with care, her posture relaxed but attentive. The natural world responded to her as if she were part of it rather than its overseer. Hades watched silently, neither approaching nor withdrawing, noting the way the flowers leaned toward her, as though recognizing her presence. He did not speak. He did not consider interrupting her work. Hades was not a god of impulse. Yet something about the scene lingered in his thoughts, long after he returned to the underworld. It was not emotion that stirred him, nor longing. It was observation. Persephone embodied a force that the world needed a counterbalance to decline, a cycle that allowed life to renew itself. Her presence completed the pattern of existence in a way that had not been evident before. In the centuries that followed, Hades saw her only twice more, each instance coincidental. Once, she knelt beside a stream, studying the reflection of cloud patterns. Another time, she stood beneath a grove of olive trees, her fingers brushing the bark lightly, as though listening to the pulse within. In each encounter, she was unaware of him. He did not linger long, preferring to observe from a distance and return to his realm without creating disruption. Still, these brief encounters stayed with him, not as preoccupation, not as emotional conflict, but as a recognition that Persephone's role in the world was becoming increasingly significant. The underworld, orderly and steady, represented the end of cycles. The mortal world, vibrant and ever-changing, represented the beginning. Persephone stood at the fulcrum between these states, and Hades, whose perspective encompassed both the structural and the philosophical, understood the implications of that more clearly than any other deity. As mortal civilizations evolved, forming city-states, crafting myths, establishing rituals, Persephone's presence became embedded in cultural memory. Children learned to associate her with flowers. Farmers credited her for early rains. Artists carved her likeness into pottery, depicting her as serene, youthful, and poised between the living and the unseen. These impressions, carried by mortals into death, reached the underworld in fragmented memories that drifted among the newly arrived souls. Hades never encouraged these impressions, yet he did not ignore them. Mortals sensed patterns, even when they lacked full understanding. Through their memories and fears, the boundaries between realms revealed subtle tendencies. Persephone's influence touched both sides of existence. Over time, Hades recognized a practical truth. The cycles she embodied would eventually intersect with the underworld, not through coincidence, but through necessity. All growing things depended on renewal. All seasons required transition. The world's balance could not be maintained through separation alone. This realization marked a turning point, not in Hades' internal world, but in the structure of fate. And Hades, whose perspective encompassed both the structural and the philosophical, understood the implications of that more clearly than any other deity. As mortal civilizations evolved, forming city-states, crafting myths, establishing rituals, Persephone's presence became embedded in cultural memory. Children learned to associate her with flowers. Farmers credited her for early rains. Demeter watched her daughter with care, sharpened by centuries of tending fields, orchards, and the fragile balance of mortal survival. No deity understood loss as Demeter did. No goddess guarded a single bond with more devotion. Her attention was constant, and the mortal world benefited from it. Under Demeter's guidance, crops flourished, and famine rarely struck. Under Persephone's presence, the early springs felt gentler, the later summers less severe. For while the underworld required order, the mortal world required cycles, and Persephone, who embodied the renewal that followed decay, stood at the threshold where those cycles intertwined. As the next age of gods approached, the world would bring Hades and Persephone into alignment not through chance, but through the deeper logic that governed all realms, the abduction and the rift of worlds. Persephone grew into adulthood in a world shaped by the rhythm of her mother's vigilance. Demeter noticed these instincts immediately and tightened her guardianship. She encouraged Persephone to remain within familiar places, claiming that other gods envied her beauty and influence. Demeter had endured the Titanomachy, had watched the world shift under divine conflict, and had seen how desire, rivalry, and ambition shaped the fates of gods and mortals alike. She wanted none of those forces to reach her daughter, but forces beyond desire were already at work. In the underworld, the arrival of souls continued with steady rhythm. Through their memories, Persephone's image entered Hades' awareness with increasing frequency, not as obsession, not as longing, but as consequence. Mortals began attaching new meanings to her presence. She became linked to seasonal renewal, to the promise that life could return after hardship. Some farmers buried seeds while whispering her name, believing she blessed the cycle of rebirth. When they died, those memories took shape in faint impressions within the underworld echoes of Persephone, tied to roots, soil, and renewal. Hades observed these impressions with methodical interest. The souls spoke of her with reverence, as though she were a concept rather than a deity. They viewed her as the bridge between abundance and the fear of scarcity. Their memories, though often blurred by Lethe, retained an unusual clarity whenever they involved Persephone. That clarity presented a pattern. Her existence influenced how mortals understood the boundaries of life, and in turn, how their souls approached death. Hades understood cycles. He saw in Persephone the embodiment of transition that the cosmos required, yet he did not consider acting upon this understanding. He neither approached her nor sought what lay above his realm. The world, however, moved toward alignment on its own. One late afternoon on the mortal surface, Persephone wandered with her attendants through a meadow that shimmered under warm sunlight. It lay far from the boundaries Demeter preferred, but close enough that the earth still bore Demeter's imprint. The grasses were tall and golden, bending in gentle waves. Clusters of violets dotted the field, and the distant mountains cast long, soft shadows. Persephone moved ahead of the others, drawn by a cluster of flowers that seemed to glow with unusual brightness. She knelt to gather them, brushing her fingers along delicate petals. The earth beneath her was rich with life. She felt it hum faintly, a sensation she had known since childhood, but deeper now. Resonating with something ancient, she leaned closer to examine a single blossom, unaware that her attendants had drifted behind a small rise in the land, out of sight but not out of reach. As Persephone reached for the final flower in the cluster, the ground shifted beneath her, not violently, not suddenly. It parted with the slow deliberation of stone separating along its natural grain. A deep, wide fissure opened, releasing a cool draft from below. The air changed, no longer scented with sunlight and blossoms, but carrying the faint mineral tone of the underworld. Persephone rose to her feet, startled but not yet afraid. She took a step backward, and the fissure widened. From the seam in the earth, a chariot emerged, drawn by massive black horses whose hooves left no scorch marks, only impressions that cooled the grass where they struck. The chariot's wheels turned without sound. Its frame was dark metal, the kind that absorbed sunlight rather than reflecting it. At its helm stood Hades. He did not appear as a shadow or as a figure cloaked in terror. He emerged plainly, without spectacle. His expression was steady, his posture composed, his presence neither threatening nor inviting. Hades never acted out of impulse. Every action he took adhered to the structure he maintained. Their eyes met. Persephone saw a god unlike any she had known. No radiance surrounded him, no storm, no display of anger or desire. His gaze carried depth rather than fire, an understanding shaped by centuries of observing life from the vantage of its conclusion. Hades saw a young goddess whose presence held the vitality he associated with beginnings, not endings. The impression he had formed through mortal memories became grounded in physical reality. Persephone embodied transition itself. She belonged to the cycle that connected his realm to the world above. Her existence was not simply aesthetic or symbolic, it was structural. The fissure continued widening, and the meadow trembled. Persephone's attendants cried out and began rushing toward her. Hades did not look at them. He looked only at the goddess standing in front of him, seeing in her not possession but inevitability. The earth beneath Persephone fractured fully. She stumbled, not from fear but from the sudden shift underfoot. Hades reached forward, not aggressively, but with purpose, to prevent her from falling into the widening chasm. His hand closed around her wrist at the exact moment the ground gave way. She was pulled into the chariot not through force, but through the movement of the earth itself, which sealed the path around them, as though completing an action long embedded into the world's design. The horses surged into motion with controlled speed, the chariot descending into the opening fissure as petals spiraled through the air and the last rays of daylight swept across Persephone's face. Her attendants reached the spot too late. The fissure closed cleanly, leaving the meadow intact except for scattered flowers and a stillness that felt unnatural. Below, as the chariot descended through winding caverns illuminated by faint glimmers of mineral light, Persephone steadied herself. Hades did not speak. He did not pull her close, nor restrain her beyond what was needed to ensure she did not fall during the descent. His grip remained firm and measured. She looked at him calmly, her breath steadying as she observed the controlled precision of his posture. The path grew darker. The air cooled. The chariot transitioned from stone tunnels into open space, the vast cavern of the underworld's upper boundary. Rivers reflected dim light. The walls hummed with ancient echoes. Persephone saw everything with eyes that had never known such depths. Hades slowed the horses and guided the chariot through the first archway of his realm. Persephone did not ask questions. She did not plead. She observed. Her composure surprised even him. Most mortals arriving in death carried fear, and most gods who visited the underworld arrived with defensiveness. Persephone carried neither. She processed the world around her with the calm that had defined her since childhood. He led her to his palace not as a captive dragged before a throne, but as someone entering a space where a role awaited clarification. When she stepped off the chariot, her feet touched the stone floor without trembling. She looked around, taking in corridors shaped by order rather than ornament. She felt the stillness of the underworld settle around her, not oppressive, but deliberate. Hades dismissed the horses with a soft gesture and turned to her. Below the mortal world, above the deepest pits of Tartarus, two deities faced one another in silence, one shaped by cycles of renewal, the other by the inevitability of endings. Neither fully understood the implications of their meeting. Yet the underworld had shifted with her arrival, and the mortal world above would soon feel the consequences. And in the fields above, Demeter felt the absence instantly. Her daughter had vanished. The earth knew it. The wind knew it. The crops knew it. And the balance that Persephone's presence once preserved began its slow, irreversible tilt. Bargains with Olympus. Demeter felt the absence the moment Persephone slipped beneath the surface of the world. There was no delay, no gradual realization, just a sudden, hollow quiet where her daughter's presence had always rested. It struck her not as a whisper but as a rupture, a tearing of something fundamental. The earth under Demeter's feet dimmed. The fields around her sagged as though an unseen weight pressed upon them, and the soft equilibrium of seasons faltered. Her breath caught, not with panic at first, but with the certainty that something unnatural had occurred. She searched the fields relentlessly, calling Persephone's name until her voice broke. The nymphs who had accompanied Persephone approached with trembling explanations, describing the sudden opening of the earth, the chariot of shadows, and the figure who had emerged with solemn composure. Demeter listened without interrupting. Her eyes remained fixed on the meadow Persephone had vanished from. She knelt and pressed her palms into the disturbed soil, sensing the faint residue of an ancient power, underworld power. There was no ambiguity in what she found. Demeter rose, and the world changed with her. The grass around her yellowed, the flowers curled inward, a coldness seeped into the soil. Birds fell silent in the branches above, sensing a shift in the natural order. Demeter's grief radiated outward not in loud cries but through the very structure of nature she had once nurtured. Her mourning was not emotional expression, it was ecological collapse. She began wandering the earth in search of her daughter, abandoning her divine duties entirely. Fields dried behind her, rivers shrank, the early signs of famine spread gradually, unnoticed at first, then unmistakable. Bargains with Olympus. Demeter felt the absence the moment Persephone slipped beneath the surface of the world. There was no delay, no gradual realization, just a sudden, hollow quiet where her daughter's presence had always rested. It struck her not as a whisper but as a rupture, a tearing of something fundamental. The earth under Demeter's feet dimmed. The fields around her sagged as though an unseen weight pressed upon them, and the soft equilibrium of seasons faltered. She sensed the importance of their task, but did not approach them. The judges, in turn, watched her with interest. They felt the shift she carried, a ripple of vitality in a realm defined by its neutrality. Next, Hades guided her past the rivers, the Styx, glittering with the sharp tone of oaths, Acheron murmuring with unresolved sorrow, Phlegethon glowing with inner heat, Cocytus echoing with lamentation, and Lethe shimmering gently in its own quiet flow. Persephone stopped at each riverbank, listening to the currents as though trying to understand the nature of each. She did not touch the waters. She simply absorbed their presence. In her silence, Hades recognized something unusual. Persephone adapted to the underworld, not with fear or revulsion, but with deliberate observation. She recognized its structure and its purpose, even without guidance. Where other deities saw the underworld as bleak or oppressive, she saw systems of order intertwined with natural consequence. Her perception impressed him, though he did not voice the thought. Still, she asked no questions. Hades offered no explanations. Their silence was not tension but assessment, each observing the other, each understanding that their meeting was not random. Above, Demeter's despair grew unbearable. Heroines, nymphs, minor gods, even mortal travelers were questioned about Persephone's fate. None offered answers. Demeter approached Helios, the all-seeing sun, demanding truth. Helios hesitated. The sun god rarely intervened in disputes among the Olympians, yet he could not deny what he had witnessed. He spoke with measured clarity. He told her that Hades had taken Persephone, that the earth had opened beneath her, that Zeus had known of the possibility, if not the precise moment, long before it occurred. Demeter heard only the first part. Her grief sharpened into fury. She confronted Zeus directly on Olympus, arriving not as the goddess of harvests, but as a force stripped of restraint. The gardens of Olympus wilted as she approached. The clouds above paled. Even the winds shifted course, unable to ignore her presence. Zeus faced her with the confidence of a ruler who believed the structure of the universe could withstand any conflict. He attempted reassurance, stating that Persephone was unharmed, that Hades was not cruel, and that the underworld was as essential as the heavens or the sea. Demeter refused these explanations. She argued that no child of hers belonged in a place devoid of sunlight, warmth, or growth. She accused Zeus of carelessness. She demanded her daughter's immediate return. Zeus countered with rationality. Hades was a sovereign god, not a villain. His realm needed structure, and Persephone had a role within that structure. The world operated on interdependent cycles. and Persephone's presence in the underworld might prove essential. Demeter did not accept the argument. She issued a single, devastating ultimatum. If Persephone was not returned, she would withdraw her power from the earth entirely. Zeus attempted to negotiate, but Demeter's resolve was absolute. She turned away, leaving Olympus with the heaviness of a storm that refused to break. As she descended to the mortal world, her power receded with her. Fields turned barren. Winter crept across lands that should have remained fertile. The world slowed into stillness, and humanity began to starve. Mortals prayed at shrines for deliverance, their pleas carried upward through the thinning fabric of life. Zeus watched the crisis unfold with growing concern. He recognized that divine disputes could not be allowed to unravel the mortal world. The balance among gods depended on mortals, their worship, their presence, their stories. Without them, the structure of existence would falter. He called for Hermes. The swift messenger descended to the underworld, weaving between shadows with practiced ease. He found Hades seated in the obsidian hall of his palace, reviewing reports from the judges. Persephone stood nearby, observing the process with steady curiosity. Hermes delivered Zeus's message concisely. The world was suffering. Fields lay empty. Mortals were dying. Demeter refused to restore her influence until Persephone returned. Zeus demanded negotiation. Hades listened, expression unchanged. He did not deny the severity of the mortal crisis. He understood the consequences thoroughly. The underworld was beginning to fill with souls too soon, and in numbers that threatened its balance. Every famine death strengthened Demeter's argument, but it also disrupted the order Hades had built. When Hermes finished speaking, Hades turned to Persephone, not seeking permission, not asserting authority, but examining her reaction. She met his gaze without hesitation. Her expression held neither fear nor resentment. Instead, she showed the composed attentiveness that had marked her since the moment she arrived. The decision ahead would shape not only their fates, but the structure of the cosmos itself. Hades agreed to negotiation. Hermes led Persephone upward, guiding her along the path that separated the realms. Hades followed, moving with the calm steadiness that defined him. When they emerged into the mortal world, Demeter rushed to her daughter, embracing her with overwhelming relief. The land responded instantly. Snow receded, frost thawed, the first green shoots pierced through soil hardened by grief. But the world had changed too drastically for a simple reunion to restore balance. Zeus stood between the two goddesses, Hades at his side, Hermes waiting to relay the agreement that must be reached. The tension among them was not emotional flourish, but the pressure of systems colliding, seasons, cycles, structure, necessity. Zeus proposed the compromise that would shape the turning of the year for all time. Persephone would return to the world above, restoring Demeter's joy and the earth's vitality. But she would also spend part of the year in the underworld, fulfilling a role essential to its structure. The number of months was determined by the pomegranate. During her time below, Persephone had eaten several seeds, offered to her an act with binding consequences. The underworld acknowledged what was consumed within it. Those seeds tied her to Hades' realm not as prisoner, but as participant. Demeter resisted the compromise. Hades remained silent but committed in his acceptance. Persephone listened to both sides without speaking. Her voice, when she finally used it, was calm and steady. She would abide by the agreement, not because of divine law, not because of Demeter or Hades, but because she had seen the underworld's structure and recognized its necessity. She understood the cycles that governed existence, and she accepted her place within them not as captive, but as sovereign. The bargain was sealed, and the world began to turn on a new axis, one shaped by a goddess who lived part of each year above in light and part below in the quiet order of endings. A queen in the darkness, When Persephone stepped once more into the underworld after the first great negotiation with Olympus, the realm greeted her differently than before. Her earlier arrival had been sudden, shaped by a moment of cosmic alignment and a fissure in the earth. This return, however, took place under the structure of a formal agreement. She did not descend as a figure pulled by circumstance, but as someone who now held an acknowledged place in the architecture of two worlds. The air in the underworld shifted when she arrived, not dramatically, not with bright flourishes or ceremonial displays, but with a subtle change in tone, as though the realm understood it would now coexist with a presence unlike any it had held before. Hades met her at the threshold, standing at the boundary where the last vestiges of mortal light faded into the underworld's permanent twilight. He did not greet her with ritual or flourish. His posture remained composed, his expression steady. Persephone descended without hesitation, and their footsteps fell in unhurried rhythm as they moved deeper into the realm together. There was no imbalance in their movements. Neither walked ahead of the other. The underworld's halls, carved from obsidian and polished stone, seemed to absorb the echo of their presence. Persephone took in the sight of the realm with new awareness. During her first stay, she had observed rather than participated. She had studied the rivers, the judges, and the geography without forming conclusions. But the famine above and the negotiations among gods had shifted her understanding. She now approached the underworld not as a visitor, but as someone entrusted with a role within it. Hades guided her through the palace's main corridors, moving at a pace that allowed her to observe without feeling hurried. Torches lit softly as they passed, their flames modest and steady, casting warm glows over the stone walls. They did not flicker wildly or cast ominous shadows. The underworld favored consistency over spectacle. The light followed a controlled pattern, illuminating the space not for grandeur, but for clarity. At the palace's central chamber, a vast room shaped by deliberate angles and subtle curves, Hades paused. The chamber had no throne raised above others. Instead, two seats stood side by side at the same level, carved from the same dark stone, facing outward toward a large archway that overlooked a broad expanse of the realm. Persephone examined the seats briefly, noting that one bore the faint imprint of long use while the other looked untouched. Hades did not gesture or invite her verbally. His silence conveyed that the second seat belonged to her by default, not as a privilege granted but as a structural necessity of her new role. Persephone approached it with measured steps. When she sat, the underworld adjusted subtly around her presence. The faint hum that usually lingered in the air steadied into a smoother resonance. The realm acknowledged its second ruler, not through celebration, but through alignment. Hades resumed his seat beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The view before them stretched across the upper reaches of the underworld, Acheron's dark waters flowing along one edge, the plains of Asphodel undulating gently in the distance, the judges' tribunal visible as a silhouette near the center. Persephone watched the movement of souls drifting slowly across the meadows. Their progress was quiet and unhurried, reflecting the underworld's neutral nature. "What is expected of me?" Persephone asked eventually, her voice steady, not hesitant. Hades answered with clarity and without ornamentation. She would observe the functioning of the underworld, understand its structure, and make decisions in collaboration with him when matters required more than routine procedure. The judges handled individual cases, but certain decisions such as modifications to boundaries, the creation of new chambers, or the adjustment of laws required oversight from the realm's rulers. Persephone would learn these responsibilities over time. There was no expectation of immediate mastery, nor urgency in the learning process. The underworld valued precision, not haste. Persephone absorbed the explanation without outward reaction. She watched as two newly arrived souls approached the judges' tribunal, their forms faint and shimmering. The judges examined them with impartial focus. Persephone's gaze followed each movement, analyzing the efficiency of the process. She did not express sympathy or sorrow. She observed the structure. In the days that followed, Persephone began studying the realm in greater depth. She visited the rivers again, this time with the intent to understand their functions rather than marvel at their appearance. At the banks of the Styx, she asked questions about divine oaths and the consequences of breaking them. Hades provided concise answers without embellishment. Persephone listened, occasionally touching the stones near the river's edge to feel the faint vibration of oath-binding energy. At Acheron, she examined the way souls moved along the river's currents. She noticed that some drifted more slowly, weighed by unresolved burdens from their lives. She spoke with the river's spirit briefly, asking whether shifts in mortal beliefs affected the current's tempo. Acheron responded with a low resonance that Persephone interpreted with careful thought. She visited Lethe last. The quiet shimmer of the silver water drew her attention for longer than the others. She crouched by the riverbank and watched as a soul stepped into the water, its memories dissolving into pale ripples. Persephone found no sadness in the process. She recognized it as a release essential for rest. She asked no questions here. Lethe required no elaboration. The Furies approached her of their own accord several weeks into her stay. Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone arrived with the precision of enforcers, reporting to a new authority. They did not kneel. They simply stood before her and awaited instruction. Persephone did not assign tasks or make demands. She asked them to describe their recent cases, their methods, and the boundaries of their jurisdiction. The Furies responded with clipped efficiency. They observed her quietly, assessing her presence, recognizing a ruler who possessed no inclination toward arbitrary intervention. Persephone's calm influenced the underworld's atmosphere. Not in brightness, light remained sparse, but in balance. Souls who arrived with mild unrest found themselves adjusting more easily. The meadows of asphodel swayed with greater consistency. The transitions between chambers felt smoother. Even the judges noticed the subtle shifts and adapted quickly. Persephone's presence did not change the underworld's nature. It refined its functionality. In the mortal world above, Demeter restored the harvests with the same intensity she had withdrawn them. Fields revived. Rivers regained their flow. Mortals celebrated the return of abundance. Yet even amid their relief, hints of uncertainty remained. They sensed in the shifting seasons that something fundamental had changed, not catastrophically, but structurally. The world now followed a rhythm that included absence and return. Winter and spring became not merely seasonal variations, but reflections of a deeper cycle shaped by the movement of a goddess between realms. As months passed in the underworld, Persephone adapted to its environment without force or reluctance. She took her seat beside Hades during sessions of judgment that required oversight. She walked through the meadows, observing how souls settled into their resting places. She learned the pathways of Tartarus, though she entered it only once, assessing its structure and understanding its distinction from the rest of the realm. She did not linger there again. Its design was clear and its necessity obvious. Persephone's composure remained constant. Her presence was neither submissive nor defiant. She integrated into the underworld with a practicality that surprised even its ruler. Where Hades provided long-established structure, Persephone offered adaptive insight. She asked subtle questions that exposed areas in need of refinement, minor inefficiencies, or overlooked details. Hades considered her observations carefully, implementing adjustments when appropriate. Their collaboration developed without conflict. Neither sought dominance, and neither tried to influence the other's domain beyond necessity. Persephone did not attempt to alter the underworld's foundational nature, and Hades did not interfere with her responsibilities in the mortal realm. Their roles aligned naturally within the framework of cosmic balance. When the time came for Persephone to return above ground, the underworld responded to her departure as subtly as it had responded to her arrival. The hum of the realm shifted again, returning to its previous tone without losing stability. Persephone did not rush her ascent. She departed with the same composed steps she had taken upon arrival. Hades accompanied her to the boundary, stopping where the last traces of his realm thinned into the mortal world's light. He made no request that she return sooner than agreed. He made no declarations. Persephone did not promise anything beyond the existing arrangements. There was no emotional farewell, only an acknowledgement, quiet, mutual, of the roles each would resume. When she emerged into the world above, Demeter embraced her once more. The fields flourished. Mortals celebrated the return of warmth, but beneath the cycle's surface, a new stability had formed. Persephone now ruled two realms, each demanding attention at different times of the year. And when the moment arrived for her to descend again, she did so not with resistance, but with the steady acceptance of someone who understood the necessity of both worlds and her place within their turning. The great expansion of the dead. As human civilizations expanded across the Mediterranean world and far beyond its coasts, the underworld experienced a parallel transformation. Growth above created consequence below. Each new village, each emergent city-state, each flourishing kingdom produced lives that would one day arrive in Hades' realm. The increasing scale of humanity did not overwhelm the underworld, but it demanded adaptation, precise adjustments, structural refinements, and ongoing vigilance. Persephone and Hades approached these changes with steady coordination, their responsibilities now intertwined with the evolution of mortal society. The earliest eras after Persephone's establishment as queen saw modest increases in the number of souls. Hunter-gatherer communities became agricultural settlements. Trade routes formed. Mortals lived longer but remained vulnerable to illness, accidents, storms, and famine. As these small societies joined into larger structures, the flow of spirits into the underworld became more varied. Some arrived content after a life of stability. Others drifted with confusion shaped by cultural shifts, new rituals, or complexities they carried from towns that had grown beyond the rhythms their ancestors once knew. Hades monitored these changes with clinical precision. He assessed the influx, not by emotion but by pattern. The judges adjusted to the shifting nature of mortal life. Crimes became more intricate in societies with laws. Acts of courage evolved. So did the boundaries between ordinary virtue and profound self-sacrifice. Asphodel expanded in subtle increments. Elysium developed new fields to accommodate those whose lives were marked by increasing cultural richness, craftsmen, scholars, healers, and leaders whose actions shaped communities in ways earlier ages had not yet seen. Persephone observed all of this with focused attention. Her months in the underworld allowed her to study how each new wave of souls reflected changes happening above ground. She saw the difference between spirits formed in simpler pastoral communities and those shaped by growing cities. In Elysium, she noticed that some souls retained echoes of intricate knowledge, mathematics, shipbuilding, architecture. Others arrived with the weight of leadership decisions, carrying remnants of public responsibility. These impressions did not influence judgment, but they revealed the increasing complexity of mortal thought. As the first civilizations developed writing, trade networks, and long-distance navigation, the underworld experienced its first major pressure on capacity not in space, but in management. The judges' tasks grew more layered. Souls from regions far apart carried differing moral frameworks. Practices once seen as honorable in rural societies clashed with values emerging in new city-states. The judges adapted by assessing lives through broader principles rather than regional customs. Hades ensured that these refinements did not compromise fairness. Persephone evaluated how these adjustments aligned with the larger cycles of life. The underworld's geography began reflecting this complexity. Asphodel's meadows widened, their grasses shifting in subtle patterns to create more defined pathways. Elysium grew sections that accommodated souls who preferred quiet contemplation separate from those who flourished in communal tranquility. Tartarus, influenced less by number than by the gravity of mortal wrongdoing, took on additional chambers to separate malicious cruelty from thoughtless error. The structure was not punitive, it was orderly. Mortals above developed rituals to honor the dead. Burial practices evolved from simple interment to elaborate ceremonies. Grave goods became more symbolic. Offerings were placed at tombs with increasing frequency. These practices created impressions that arrived with souls, forming echoes that Persephone studied. She recognized that mortals were attempting to ease transitions between worlds, creating narratives that comforted their families and communities. Such rituals did not alter the underworld's operations, but influenced the emotional states of arriving spirits, making transitions smoother for many. Over time, new civilizations arose: Egypt with its monumental tombs, Mesopotamia with its early city-states, the Aegean cultures with their seafaring communities. Each group carried distinct beliefs about death. When these souls entered the underworld, their expectations influenced their initial reactions. Some expected judgment by a balance, others believed in shadowy wanderings. Some believed the dead continued living within their tombs. The underworld did not change to match their beliefs, but the judges learned to account for these expectations when helping souls settle. As trade increased between distant regions, the variety of souls grew even more complex. Some mortals, shaped by cross-cultural interactions, arrived with hybrid beliefs. Their experiences formed unique impressions that Persephone sometimes analyzed at length, noting how cultural blending influenced the emotional tones of the newly dead. Warfare expanded significantly during these centuries. Early city-state conflicts turned into organized campaigns. Kingdoms rose and clashed. Warriors, once accustomed to small skirmishes, became part of large armies. Battles that once involved dozens now involved hundreds or thousands. The underworld felt the impact immediately. Influxes of souls arrived in waves, whole divisions of soldiers descending together within hours. Lethe bore the weight of their collective fear and exhaustion. Thanatos worked tirelessly to ensure each death followed the proper path. Hades responded by reinforcing the structural lines that guided mass arrivals. Chambers were designated for processing large groups at once, preventing disorder. The judges coordinated with river spirits to maintain smooth transitions. The underworld remained functional even under unprecedented strain. Persephone assisted by identifying unstable emotional patterns among arriving groups, ensuring that restorative areas were ready for those who needed them. Her observations kept the system from becoming imbalanced. In the upper world, myths began forming about Hades and Persephone, not always accurately, but consistently. Mortals depicted Hades as a silent ruler, impartial and distant, while Persephone became associated with both renewal and the inevitability of descent. These stories reached the underworld as faint impressions carried in the memories of the dead. Hades ignored misconceptions. Persephone examined them with interest, recognizing how mortal interpretations reflected the larger cycles she embodied. As city-states formed structured governments, philosophical schools emerged, and societies developed richer cultural identities. Souls arriving in Hades' realm carried remnants of debates about virtue, justice, duty, and the nature of happiness. These impressions made the judges' work more nuanced. Some souls had lived with deep reflection, others had acted without thought. Some had pursued noble ideals, others had navigated ambitious political landscapes. The judges evaluated each life without bias, but their analyses grew more layered as philosophical diversity increased. Hades adapted the underworld accordingly. He created a quiet region separate from Asphodel for souls who had pursued knowledge extensively during their lives. Thinkers, mathematicians, physicians, and poets. These spirits preferred contemplation over wandering. Persephone helped identify the best location for this region, noting that souls with intellectual inclinations settled more peacefully when given space to reflect. The new chamber, while not as idyllic as Elysium, offered a stable environment suited to those whose lives were marked by inquiry. As empires began rising, mass mortality events occurred not from warfare alone but from disease, natural disasters, and large-scale migration. When volcanic eruptions, plagues, or regional collapses struck, entire populations descended within short spans of time. The underworld absorbed these events without collapsing, but they created periods of heavy activity. Hades reviewed reports constantly. Persephone monitored emotional patterns, identifying when Lethe required stronger currents or when Acheron needed additional guidance for souls burdened by sudden trauma. Through all of this, Hades and Persephone's collaborative rule remained steady. They spoke rarely, communicated through precise observation rather than extended discussion, and maintained their responsibilities without conflict. Their partnership was functional, structured, and unembellished, driven by the demands of a realm that grew with every passing century. As the Greek world entered its classical age, mortals began imagining the underworld with greater detail. Poets described its geography, philosophers questioned its fairness, dramatists shaped stories that depicted Hades and Persephone in ways both accurate and embellished. These interpretations rarely influenced the underworld directly, but they revealed how deeply mortality's understanding of death had evolved. Persephone noted one important shift. Mortals had begun associating her descent and return with the turning of seasons, linking her presence above to spring and her time below to winter. This correlation aligned with the structure that had emerged from the compromise with Demeter, and Persephone understood it as a natural consequence of cosmic cycles rather than a story driven by sentiment. With each century, the number of mortals increased, and each increase required the underworld to expand its operational capacity. Hades refined the routes leading from the rivers to the judges. He adjusted the distribution of souls among the meadows, creating more distinct sectors to prevent crowding. Persephone assisted in determining how these adjustments affected the flow of souls toward rest. During particularly heavy influxes, when entire communities perished due to war or disaster, Persephone often walked through the meadows of Asphodel, observing how souls clustered, how they adapted to the environment, and whether additional boundaries would improve the realm's efficiency. Hades reviewed her recommendations with careful thought, and together they implemented changes when necessary. The underworld, once a quiet realm waiting for its first arrivals, had become a complex system reflecting the expansion of human civilization. Its growth mirrored the mortal world's development in structure and diversity, though its purpose remained unchanged. As the world above continued shaping itself, building temples, founding academies, forming republics, the underworld below maintained equilibrium. Hades and Persephone ensured that each soul found its place, each consequence aligned with its cause, and each life ended in orderly transition. Mortals rarely understood how closely their own advances influenced the structure of the realm beneath. Yet every invention, every city, every ship that crossed a new sea, every reform of law, every philosophical debate, every triumph and tragedy, all of it flowed at last toward the underworld, where Hades and Persephone governed the ever-growing legacy of human existence. The age of epic heroes. The underworld had grown accustomed to the steady influx of mortal souls, farmers, artisans, merchants, rulers, soldiers, each carrying memories shaped by expanding civilizations. Hades and Persephone governed these transitions with precision and calm. But there came a period when the mortal world produced individuals whose names echoed far beyond their lifetimes, men whose deeds reshaped lands, toppled tyrants, founded dynasties, provoked wars, or defied divine expectations. These individuals, whom mortals later called heroes, did not merely live remarkable lives. They crossed boundaries, challenged the gods, and on rare occasions sought to penetrate the underworld itself. Their emergence marked a new era, one that introduced complexities neither Hades nor Persephone had previously encountered. The first notable wave of heroes arrived in death, their spirits carrying memories heavy with legend. Some were honored by their communities through elaborate rituals. Others arrived in the underworld as anonymous travelers, burdened by battles no songs had yet preserved. In this early phase of heroic culture, mortals believed that exceptional deeds resulted in unique afterlives. Though the judges maintained impartiality, mortals carried their expectations into the underworld, influencing their initial emotional states. But far more significant than heroes arriving in death were those who attempted entry while still alive. Each such attempt tested the underworld's boundaries, its laws, its infrastructure, and its sovereignty. The first major challenge came when Heracles, son of Zeus and a mortal woman, approached the underworld seeking to complete his final labor. He had slain the Nemean lion, cleansed the Augean stables, captured the Erymanthian boar, and endured trials that would have broken any ordinary mortal. But none of those tasks involved confronting the structure of the underworld itself. Heracles descended into the earth through a cavern in the Peloponnesian hills, determined to seize Cerberus and bring him to the world above. Hades had been informed of the hero's approach long before he reached the gates. They crossed boundaries, challenged the gods, and on rare occasions sought to penetrate the underworld itself. Their emergence marked a new era, one that introduced complexities neither Hades nor Persephone had previously encountered. The first notable wave of heroes arrived in death, their spirits carrying memories heavy with legend. Cerberus, however, did not part. The massive three-headed guardian stepped forward, each head emitting a different sound, a low growl, a rumbling warning, and a sharp bark that reverberated through the cavern. Heracles stood his ground. The confrontation that followed did not involve weapons. Heracles did not attack the guardian. He knew such an act would disrupt the delicate balance of the realm. Instead, he used brute strength and precise movements, subduing Cerberus without drawing blood. The beast resisted fiercely, one head snapping, another lunging, the third emitting a deafening roar that sent tremors down the tunnel walls. But Heracles, trained by gods and hardened by impossible tasks, held firm until the guardian yielded. When Heracles presented himself before Hades, the king regarded him with a level gaze. Persephone stood beside Hades, her presence calm and observant. Heracles bowed but did not kneel. He explained his mission concisely, refraining from appeal or embellishment. Hades listened, recognizing that Heracles was not acting out of malice, but necessity immortal, following the trajectory of a heroic destiny shaped partly by Zeus's influence. Hades granted Heracles permission to take Cerberus to the world above, but with a condition. The hero must not use weapons or cause harm. Heracles accepted the terms without hesitation. Persephone observed Heracles carefully, noting his respect for the realm's structure. When the hero ascended with Cerberus, mortal singers later exaggerated the difficulty of the task, but the underworld remembered it as a demonstration of unusual discipline rather than reckless intrusion. Heracles returned Cerberus unharmed. When he guided the creature back to its place at the threshold, Hades acknowledged the hero's adherence to the condition. Cerberus resumed its sentinel position with no disruption to the underworld's order. But Heracles was only the first. Another hero who tested the boundary between life and death was Orpheus, a mortal known not for strength, but for the unparalleled beauty of his music. His descent into the underworld was driven by grief following the death of Eurydice, a woman he loved with devotion so intense that it pierced the barriers between worlds. Orpheus approached through caverns near Thrace, carrying a lyre whose strings glowed faintly with divine influence. When he reached the border, the shades of the dead gathered in stillness around him. Even Cerberus, whose vigilance did not falter under normal circumstances, lowered its three heads and listened. No mortal had ever influenced the underworld through sound alone. Yet Orpheus's melodies carried the imprint of longing, sharpened by sincerity, a force the underworld had rarely encountered. Rivers slowed their currents. The Furies paused in mid-flight. The judges stopped their deliberations. The underworld listened. Persephone stood at the palace threshold as the hero approached. Hades joined her, both observing the mortal who dared request the return of a soul. Orpheus did not plead. He did not speak dramatically. He simply let the music convey his grief and his hope. The effect was unusual. Persephone, who understood cycles of loss and renewal, assessed Orpheus's request carefully. Hades examined the structural implications. Returning a soul was no small matter. It threatened the integrity of the boundary that separated life from death. But the music's sincerity introduced a rare case. A mortal whose emotional clarity aligned with the cosmic principles Persephone represented. After a long exchange of silent consideration between Persephone and Hades, a conditional agreement was made. Eurydice could return to the mortal world on a single condition. Orpheus must not look back at her until they reached the surface. The condition ensured that the boundary remained unbroken by direct violation. The failure of that ascent, the single backward glance, became legend. But in the underworld's account, the significant element was the structure. A mortal was permitted to escort a soul upward, illustrating how rare circumstances could be acknowledged without undermining cosmic balance. The third notable descent was made by Theseus and Pirithous, whose intentions diverged sharply from those of Orpheus. They entered the underworld seeking not restoration, but acquisition. Both heroes had acted boldly in life, but boldness alone did not equate to wisdom. Their plan to seize Persephone and bring her to the mortal world demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of divine jurisdiction. When they crossed the threshold, Cerberus confronted them with immediate hostility. Theseus and Pirithous fought, but unlike Heracles, they lacked the discipline required to respect the realm's balance. They forced their way past the Guardian, creating disorder that spread quickly through the underworld's corridors. Spirits scattered in confusion. The Furies mobilized. The river's rhythms wavered. Hades intercepted them in the chamber of Lethe, where the air shimmered faintly with the essence of forgotten memories. Persephone stood beside him, her posture steady but alert. The intruders attempted to speak, declaring their intentions with the confidence of mortals who had mistaken divine laws for challenges to overcome. Hades listened without interruption. When they finished, he offered no direct refutation. He simply acted. Their plan to seize Persephone and bring her to the mortal world demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of divine jurisdiction. When they crossed the threshold, Cerberus confronted them with immediate hostility. Theseus and Pirithous fought, but unlike Heracles, they lacked the discipline required to respect the realm's balance. They forced their way past the Guardian, creating disorder that spread quickly through the underworld's corridors. Spirits scattered in confusion. Pirithous remained where he had fallen, absorbed into the underworld structure as a reminder that mortal ambition could not seize what belonged to cosmic architecture. Other heroes came over the centuries. Odysseus, who sought prophecy, Aeneas, who carried ancestral duty, and lesser-known figures whose stories were preserved only in fragments. Each encounter left an impression on the underworld. Odysseus approached with careful strategy, seeking the shade of the prophet Tiresias. He performed the necessary rites, guided by divine instruction. His journey was efficient, respectful, and brief. He asked nothing that threatened the realm's order. Persephone watched from a distance, evaluating how mortal cunning differed from brute strength or pure emotion. Aeneas, guided by the Sibyl, followed the structured path with even greater discipline. His descent was ceremonial, marked by reverence rather than daring. Theseus found himself immobilized, held in place by a force that did not inflict pain but prevented movement entirely. Pirithous, who had conceived the plan, faced a far harsher consequence. The earth beneath him opened, binding him in a seated position from which he would never rise. No torture, no fire, no spectacle, just permanence. Theseus was eventually freed, not through his own actions but due to Heracles' later intervention during another descent. He sought knowledge of his people's destiny, an inquiry that aligned with the underworld's function as a repository of ancestral memory. Persephone recognized in him a quality rare among mortals, the ability to absorb the weight of what he witnessed without collapsing under its implications. Across these encounters, Hades maintained a consistent stance. Intrusion was tolerated only when aligned with cosmic necessity or explicit structure. As the heroic age matured, mortality's perception of the gods evolved. Hades became known not as cruel or vengeful, but as a sovereign who upheld balance. Persephone became associated more strongly with transition, not merely between seasons, but between life and death, despair and renewal. The underworld did not change its essence during this era, but it responded with increased sophistication to the complexities introduced by heroic culture. The judges refined their interpretations, the rivers adjusted their currents, the Furies sharpened their vigilance. Cerberus became more discerning, allowing none to pass without purpose. And Hades and Persephone continued their steady rulership, guiding the realm calmly through an age when mortals sought more actively than ever to understand what lay beyond their final breath. Monsters, guardians, and the living dead. The underworld, though a realm of order and carefully maintained boundaries, was never an empty system composed solely of rivers, chambers, judges, and drifting souls. From its earliest formation, it contained beings whose existence predated mortal memory, creatures and entities shaped by ancient forces, by primordial conflict, by cosmic necessity, and by the intersection of life and death. As the centuries progressed and mortal civilizations expanded, these inhabitants of the underworld developed roles that complemented or reinforced the structure Hades and Persephone governed. Some served as protectors, others as enforcers, and a few existed as remnants of earlier eras whose presence required careful management. Cerberus remained the most visible symbol of underworld guardianship, but he was far from alone. His vigilance at the gates represented only the first layer of security. Beyond him lay ecosystems of creatures and spirits, whose existence made the realm functional entities that mortals would later describe in myths, sometimes with accuracy, often with embellishment. In the earliest eras of the underworld, before mortals had imagined its geography in detail, serpentine forms slithered through caverns, carved by subterranean heat. These creatures, later known to mortals as dracones, possessed bodies composed of dense mineral scales that resonated faintly with the vibrations of rivers and walls. They were not creations of Hades or Persephone. They were remnants of the earliest geological shaping of the realm, formed when pockets of energy pooled within the Earth's crust and forged living matter from raw mineral flow. Dracones posed no threat to souls. They fed on the metallic particulates suspended in subterranean currents and moved through tunnels with silent precision. However, their presence required careful oversight, as their burrowing could alter pathways or weaken structural boundaries. Hades monitored their activity and occasionally redirected them with subtle projections of divine influence. Another class of creature, the Lampades torches of Nyx, who had drifted into the underworld after their origins in the realm of night, wandered the pathways carrying lanterns that did not burn with heat. Their light was faint, bluish, and emitted no shadows. Mortals imagined them as mischievous, but in the underworld, they served a more practical function, guiding lost souls toward judgment corridors, particularly during influxes caused by natural disasters. They appeared unpredictably, but always in places where their presence was required. Persephone studied their behavior during her stays, noting patterns in how they congregated near Lethe during seasons of heavy mortality in the mortal world. Although not officially part of Hades' retinue, the Lampades acted with instinctive alignment to the realm's needs. The Furies Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone remained the most significant enforcers. Their authority extended not only over mortals, but also over divine beings who violated oaths. Their wings carried them across vast stretches of the underworld, with speed unmatched by any other creature. They were not born of the underworld, but found a natural place within it. Their duties required constant vigilance, and their presence in both mortal and divine affairs ensured that cosmic order did not fall to negligence. What mortals later described as the Erinyes' shrieking fury was, in truth, directed precision. They did not act without cause, nor did they inflict torment for pleasure. Their interventions were systematic expressions of consequence. Hades and Persephone rarely intervened in their work, trusting their ancient authority. The Furies reported only when cases threatened to unsettle broader stability, such as when mortal rulers violated sacred treaties or when factions of souls attempted disruptive alliances. Along the deeper corridors of Tartarus, beyond the judge's oversight, the oldest monsters of creation dwelled. These beings, such as Campe, the serpentine guardian, with a body composed of layered coils and a gaze capable of paralyzing titanic creatures, served as keepers of the Titan's prison. Campe's presence prevented any attempt at escape. Mortals later portrayed her as monstrous, but she possessed intelligence, sharpened by millennia of isolation. Hades communicated with her rarely, as her loyalty required no reinforcement, and her role never changed. In the same deep regions lingered the ghosts of primeval giants who had fallen in conflicts predating human memory. Some of these giants remained bound to specific caverns by ancient chains forged in the starless era before the Olympians. They did not roam, nor did they interfere with the underworld's daily operations. Their existence simply marked the remnants of an older order, visible reminders that the underworld encompassed not only the dead, but the history of cosmic battles long buried. Persephone, upon visiting these deep regions during her initial centuries as queen, studied each entity with observational detachment. Her familiarity with natural ecosystems above ground informed her understanding of the underworld's creatures. She recognized that stability depended on acknowledging their roles, rather than attempting to reshape them according to aesthetic or moral preferences. Hades valued her interpretations, particularly when her insights revealed how small adjustments redirecting a dracone's burrowing path or assigning the Lampides to new corridors during heavy influxes could optimize the realm's functioning. Beyond the monstrous guardians existed another category of presence: the living dead. Mortal myths later exaggerated this idea into visions of shambling corpses or reanimated bodies, but the underworld's version of the living dead was far more subtle and systematic. These were souls whose connection to their physical lives had not fully dissolved, individuals who died suddenly, violently, or with unresolved burdens so intense that their transition into full spiritual form had stalled. Such souls drifted in a state mortals later called the restless dead. They were neither malevolent nor mindless. They simply moved along the boundaries of the underworld, searching for resolution that had not been achieved in mortal existence. Their presence required oversight to prevent them from clustering or disrupting the flow of newly arrived souls. Yet Orpheus's melodies carried the imprint of longing sharpened by sincerity, a force the underworld had rarely encountered. Rivers slowed their currents. The Furies paused in mid-flight. The judges stopped their deliberations. The underworld listened. Persephone stood at the palace threshold as the hero approached. Hades joined her, both observing the mortal who dared request the return of a soul. Orpheus did not plead. He did not speak dramatically. Persephone recommended procedural refinements that prevented bottlenecks in emotional processing. Thanatos, the god of gentle death, played a significant role in preventing the phenomenon of the restless dead from becoming destabilizing. His task was to ensure peaceful final moments whenever possible, guiding the dying with steady presence. Mortals rarely understood his nature, often fearing him as a symbol of loss, but the underworld recognized him as a stabilizing force. Thanatos delivered souls to the realm in a state that was less chaotic than those claimed by violence or sudden disaster. Persephone found that Thanatos' presence affected Lethe's currents, smoothing transitions during seasons of epidemic or famine. Over time, the underworld developed specialized spirits called psychopomps, lesser beings, who assisted Thanatos and the Lampades. These entities, faint and translucent, guided the newly dead through the initial disorientation of arrival. They communicated through impression rather than speech, directing souls toward the judges or calming those who struggled with fear. Hades authorized their presence after noting inefficiencies in the earliest centuries of increased mortality. Persephone refined their deployment by mapping how emotions pooled within various regions of the underworld, ensuring psychopomps were stationed where needed most. One of the most complex phenomena Hades and Persephone had to manage involved the emergence of liminal creatures, spirits formed not from individual souls, but from collective human fears. When mortals believed intensely in certain supernatural beings, the underworld sometimes reflected those beliefs in faint echoes. These echoes did not act independently or hold true substance, but they influenced the emotional landscape temporarily. For example, when a coastal civilization developed intense fears of vengeful sea spirits dragging sailors into the depths, faint impressions of those imagined beings drifted near the Acheron corridors, influencing the newly arrived souls from those regions. Persephone examined these impressions and found them dissociated from actual creatures. Hades recognized that such collective images represented the psychological residue mortals carried into death. To prevent these impressions from affecting the underworld's functioning, Hades and Persephone established containment zones, regions where emotional echoes dissipated gradually without influencing other souls. This system prevented confusion or distortion of judgment, ensuring the underworld remained a place of clarity rather than fear. As centuries passed, more creatures became associated with the underworld, some accurately, others through mortal misunderstanding. The Keres, for instance, were often imagined by humans as women with black wings who hovered over battlefields seeking lives to claim. In truth, the Keres were personifications of violent death, but they did not swarm battlefields in physical form. They influenced the final moments of those mortals destined for violent ends, ensuring that Thanatos, who governed peaceful death, did not intervene in those cases. Their presence prevented inconsistencies in the cosmic order. Persephone observed their function closely, recognizing that violence, though tragic, existed as a stable phenomenon within mortal societies. Ghosts who clung to the boundaries between worlds, spirits the Greeks later called idola, also required structured management. Some remained tethered to the mortal world due to unresolved attachments, leaving faint traces that mortals interpreted as hauntings. Hades monitored the threads connecting such spirits to the living, allowing dissolution only when both sides of the boundary stabilized. Persephone assisted in identifying patterns in these attachments, seeing them not as anomalies but extensions of mortal emotional complexity. In rare cases, divine beings interacted with underworld creatures in ways that required intervention. For example, when certain gods attempted to employ underworld entities for their own purposes, such as sending spirits to deliver messages, or using impressions of fear to influence mortal worship, Hades responded with immediate correction. The underworld's neutrality could not be compromised by divine politics. Persephone supported this stance, understanding that the stability of her seasonal duties above depended on the integrity of her realm below. Even more rarely, underworld creatures found themselves entangled in mortal rituals. Necromancers, individuals who attempted to summon the dead, sometimes drew the attention of lesser underworld beings. Hades did not forbid such practices outright, but he monitored them carefully. When necromancy risked destabilizing the separation between realms, consequences followed. Persephone studied these rituals as reflections of mortal attempts to understand death, discerning which practices posed genuine threats versus those that reflected cultural superstition. Through it all, the underworld's ecosystem remained functional because its inhabitants, monstrous or subtle, operated within a structure refined over ages. Hades provided the foundational architecture. Persephone identified where cycles intersected or where emotional patterns required calibration. The Furies enforced consequence. Cerberus guarded the threshold. Psychopomps guided transitions. Dracones maintained subterranean equilibrium. Lampides illuminated pathways. Thanatos maintained boundaries between peace and violence. Keres clarified distinctions within mortal fate. Together, these beings formed an interconnected system that mortals only glimpsed in fragmented myths and poetic interpretations. But in the underworld itself, each creature's presence served a purpose. Each spirit held a place. Each boundary remained reinforced. And, as the age of epic heroes transitioned into the next era of human development, the underworld, organized, inhabited, and continuously adapting, stood ready to absorb the stories that would soon descend from cities growing across the Mediterranean world and newly rising cultures beyond its horizon. The reach of death in the mortal world. As the centuries advanced and human civilizations expanded into empires, networks, and interconnected societies, the underworld's operations grew increasingly intertwined with events occurring far above its boundaries. Hades and Persephone observed these developments with methodical precision, recognizing that mortality's patterns were no longer shaped solely by natural causes or small-scale conflicts. Now the world produced wars of astonishing magnitude, plagues that traveled across continents, and political structures capable of uplifting or devastating entire populations. Each shift in human history sent consequences downward, requiring the underworld to monitor, adjust, and maintain equilibrium with consistency. In earlier ages, the arrival of souls followed rhythms that aligned with seasonal changes, isolated conflicts, or local misfortunes. But as city-states expanded into kingdoms and kingdoms into empires, mortality grew increasingly influenced by human decisions, military campaigns, territorial ambition, political reforms, economic structures, and social hierarchies. These elements altered the flow and character of the dead, and the underworld had to process the resulting complexity with unwavering order. The first major indicators of this transformation emerged when empires began shaping vast regions. But in the underworld itself, each creature's presence served a purpose. Each spirit held a place. Each boundary remained reinforced. And, as the age of epic heroes transitioned into the next era of human development, the underworld, organized, inhabited, and continuously adapting, stood ready to absorb the stories that would soon descend from cities growing across the Mediterranean world and newly rising cultures beyond its horizon. But as city-states expanded into kingdoms and kingdoms into empires, mortality grew increasingly influenced by human decisions, military campaigns, territorial ambition, political reforms, economic structures, and social hierarchies. These elements altered the flow and character of the dead, and the underworld had to process the resulting complexity with unwavering order. The first major indicators of this transformation emerged when empires began shaping vast regions. The judges noted an increase in cases shaped not by individual choice, but by political pressures imposed upon entire populations. Persephone studied these influxes during her months below, noticing patterns that reflected the tightening structures of mortal governance. Souls from imperial centers often carried impressions of bureaucracy, record-keeping, and infrastructure roads, canals, taxation systems. The Greeks, meanwhile, developed an intellectual culture that produced philosophers whose reflections on virtue, justice, and the afterlife created new complexities in how souls understood their own lives. Socrates, whose death by hemlock later brought him to the underworld, arrived with a mind already structured for rigorous self-examination. When he stood before the judges, his acceptance of consequence was clear. His impressions contained no fear, only an interest in understanding the process. Such arrivals demonstrated how mortal thought could influence the emotional stability of souls, though never the fairness of judgment. Beyond philosophy, the expansion of Greek city-states also produced events that forced the underworld to process unprecedented surges in mortality. The Peloponnesian War sent soldiers and civilians alike into Hades' realm in numbers that fluctuated dramatically from year to year. Many souls arrived with confusion shaped by political propaganda, shifting loyalties, and cultural fractures. Hades did not interfere with mortal conflict, but he monitored how these conditions influenced the emotional landscape of arrivals. The plague that struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War presented a different kind of influx, rapid, chaotic, driven by illness rather than violence. Souls arrived in waves, some carrying feverish impressions, others disoriented by sudden death. Persephone examined these influxes closely, noting that groups afflicted by plague often required more time in the transitional zones before approaching the judges. Hades adjusted pathways to ensure that processing remained orderly. As civilizations expanded across the Mediterranean and the Near East, new forms of warfare emerged. Iron weapons allowed armies to grow larger and more destructive. Fortified cities fell with increasing frequency. Naval power allowed conflicts to reach distant shores. The underworld felt each of these expansions in the form of amplified surges, arrivals shaped by sieges, famine, disease, and mass displacement. The rise of Rome produced the most prolonged transformation in how the underworld interacted with mortality. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, brought unprecedented organization to warfare, law, and civil administration. Some were honored by their communities through elaborate rituals. Others arrived in the underworld as anonymous travelers burdened by battles no songs had yet preserved. In this early phase of heroic culture, mortals believed that exceptional deeds resulted in unique afterlives. Though the judges maintained impartiality, mortals carried their expectations into the underworld, influencing their initial emotional states. Their understanding of law was structured, but their understanding of mortality was fragmented. Roman funeral customs, including the practice of imagining ancestors watching over the living, created echoes that lingered faintly within the underworld's emotional fields. Hades monitored these impressions to ensure that they did not blur the distinction between living rituals and the reality of death. As the Roman Empire expanded, mortality increased, not only from warfare, but from large-scale engineering and urbanization. Massive construction projects led to accidents. Densely populated cities experienced outbreaks of illness. Droughts, floods, and fires consumed regions that had grown dependent on complex infrastructure. Each event sent waves of souls downward, carrying memories shaped by the fragility of human systems. Persephone, during her yearly return to the underworld, observed these changes with calm interest. She recognized that the mortal world had moved far beyond the simple communities of earlier millennia. It now produced political innovations, philosophical schools, and cultural networks that influenced how souls transitioned after death. She suggested refinements to the transitional zones to accommodate souls who carried multi-layered emotional states, those shaped by overlapping identities, shifting loyalties, and complex family structures. Hades implemented adjustments to the judges' operations, ensuring they had the necessary structural support for evaluating lives that had become increasingly intertwined with collective systems. The impartiality of judgment remained unchanged, but the process required more contextual understanding than it had in earlier ages. Throughout these developments, one phenomenon became increasingly significant: the rise of mass migrations and cultural blending. When populations moved across continents voluntarily or through forced displacement, souls arrived with impressions shaped by mixed traditions. Their beliefs about death, fate, and the afterlife became more varied. The underworld adapted by designating new spaces within Asphodel, where souls from blended cultures could settle without confusion. Natural disasters also shaped mortality in profound ways. Earthquakes devastated regions of Greece, Anatolia, and Italy. Volcanic eruptions, such as the one that destroyed Pompeii, sent entire communities into the underworld within moments. The suddenness of these events created waves of disorientation among arrivals. Persephone oversaw the distribution of psychopomps during such influxes, ensuring that souls received immediate guidance. Beyond natural disasters and empire-wide conflicts, the underworld also absorbed souls shaped by personal tragedies, lives cut short by illness, accidents, or violence that did not align with broader historical patterns. These individuals arrived with emotional impressions as significant as those shaped by war or disaster, and the underworld processed them with equal care. Across all these centuries, Hades maintained steady vigilance. He did not impose judgment upon mortal events, nor did he intervene. His role was to manage consequence. Persephone watched with the understanding of someone who governed the cycles linking life and death. Together, they ensured that the underworld's operations expanded in tandem with the world's increasing complexity. Mortals continued shaping their own destinies. Empires rose, flourished, fractured, and collapsed. Philosophies evolved. New cultures replaced older ones. Across every change, the underworld remained constant, not stagnant, but stable. Its structure adapted without losing coherence. Hades and Persephone did not react with emotion. They adjusted systems, refined pathways, and maintained balance. The boundaries between realms held firm, even as humanity transformed the surface of the world. In the centuries ahead, empires would fall, new powers would rise, religions would reshape mortal interpretations of death. Yet through every era, the underworld would continue receiving the echoes of human existence, each life contributing to the vast mosaic overseen by its two sovereign rulers. The underworld in myth and ritual. As human civilizations matured, expanded, and diversified, mortals increasingly sought to understand the realm that awaited them after death. The underworld, once a distant, unfathomable concept, became a central presence in the cultural imagination of Greeks and neighboring peoples. Though no mortal ever fully grasped the structure Hades and Persephone governed, their beliefs, rituals, and stories formed a vast interpretive landscape. Each era produced new myths. Each region developed distinct funerary practices, and every belief about death, however inaccurate, revealed how humanity processed the inevitability of endings. From the earliest Neolithic communities to the flourishing city-states of classical Greece, mortals practiced burial with instinctive reverence. They interred their dead beneath mounds of earth, in stone chambers, or within natural caves. These rituals were not governed by theological doctrine at first. Rather, they emerged from the human desire to honor lives past and to ease the transition from presence into memory. As societies evolved religious frameworks, these rituals became refined, codified, and rich with symbolism. To Hades and Persephone, the mortals' efforts to create meaning around death did not alter the underworld's structure. Yet the impressions carried by the dead revealed patterns in how humanity conceptualized their domain. Persephone noted these patterns with meticulous attention, seeing reflections of mortal fears and hopes imprinted onto the newly arrived souls. Early Greek burial practices offered simple goods: a clay cup, a tool, a small figurine. These objects left faint impressions in the memories of the souls who arrived in the underworld. Over time, burial goods grew more elaborate. Bronze weapons, painted pottery, jewelry, and even small coins accompanied the dead. The coin, placed in a corpse's mouth or hand, emerged from the belief that a ferryman guided souls across a dark river. Mortals imagined a figure named Charon, an aged boatman who demanded payment for passage. In the underworld, no such transaction existed. River spirits guided souls without need for material offerings. But the myth of Charon reflected humanity's attempts to assign structure to uncertainty. Persephone recognized that these beliefs helped mortals cope with the transition from life to death. Hades saw that such rituals provided emotional closure for the living. Neither deity sought to correct these misconceptions. Mortals needed their stories. As Greek civilization reached its height, funerary rituals became highly structured. Families washed the body, adorned it, and laid it out for mourning. Women keened and chanted laments. Men cut their hair in gestures of grief. These rituals served not only social cohesion but also emotional release. When the dead arrived in the underworld, their impressions carried the echoes of these ceremonies faint, symbolic sensations that gently eased their disorientation. Mortals believed the soul traveled a long road. Some thought it wandered through a shadowy field. Others believed it faced tests and decisions. None of these stories matched the precise structure of the underworld, yet each revealed a facet of human concern: the desire for justice, the fear of oblivion, the hope for reunion. One of the earliest and most influential myths involved the Eleusinian Mysteries, a ritual cult that honored Demeter and Persephone. Originating in the town of Eleusis, these rites promised initiates a hope of blessed conditions after death. The rituals were conducted in secrecy, their details guarded so closely that even centuries later, only fragments of their structure remain. They involved symbolic reenactments of Persephone's descent and return, demonstrating how humanity interpreted cosmic cycles through drama and ritual. Persephone paid close attention to the impressions left by initiates upon entering the underworld. She did not experience their rituals directly, but she sensed patterns, a feeling of calm, a softened fear, and an unusual serenity. These impressions suggested that the mysteries offered mortals a framework for confronting death without despair. While the rituals did not alter judgment or afterlife placement, they influenced how souls approached transition. The Eleusinian Mysteries became one of the few mortal traditions that indirectly benefited the underworld by reducing the emotional turmoil of arrival. Other myths depicted Hades himself. Mortals alternated between portraying him as austere and impartial, or fearsome and punitive. In truth, he neither punished nor rewarded by whim. When the dead arrived in the underworld, their impressions carried the echoes of these ceremonies faint, symbolic sensations that gently eased their disorientation. Mortals believed the soul traveled a long road. Some thought it wandered through a shadowy field. Others believed it faced tests and decisions. None of these stories matched the precise structure of the underworld, yet each revealed a facet of human concern: the desire for justice, the fear of oblivion, the hope for reunion. They referred to him instead as Plauton, the wealthy one, acknowledging that all Earth's riches, minerals, fertile soil, and ultimately the countless dead fell within his domain. This euphemism reflected a broader truth: death was inseparable from abundance. The underworld, though perceived as dark, sustained the world indirectly by completing the cycles that allowed life to flourish above. As Greek thought continued to evolve, philosophers introduced new interpretations. Pythagoreans believed in reincarnation, a cycle of souls passing through multiple lives. Though this belief did not match the underworld's actual process, Hades noted the conceptual symmetry. Mortals recognized that existence might involve more than a single lifetime. Some souls in Elysium did choose rebirth, though the process was selective and rare. Plato described a complex geography of the afterlife, complete with elaborate trials and cosmic rewards. His account reflected philosophical attempts to reconcile moral justice with the unpredictability of mortal life. Although the underworld did not operate exactly as he described, Plato's ideas revealed how deeply mortals wrestled with the concept of fairness after death. Dramatists added emotion and narrative to the underworld. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides populated the realm with vivid characters. Tragedies presented Hades and Persephone as figures who shaped destinies, influenced by divine politics or human courage. These portrayals remained artistic interpretations, but they reflected mortal fascination with death's role in the human story. Rituals evolved alongside myths. Tombstones became more elaborate. Families held annual rites at grave sites, offering libations, foods, and prayers. These offerings did not reach the underworld in material form, but they created emotional impressions that accompanied souls downward. Persephone understood these rituals as acts of remembrance. Hades recognized them as stabilizing forces in mortal communities. Across Greece, shrines dedicated to Persephone and Demeter appeared in fertile valleys and near rural settlements. These sanctuaries acknowledged the seasonal cycle of descent and return, linking agricultural rhythms to cosmic structure. Mortals interpreted every sprout of spring and every fallow winter as a sign of Persephone's movement between realms. Persephone herself did not experience these cycles emotionally. Her duties were structured, not sentimental, but she recognized that mortal interpretations served important cultural functions. Outside Greece, other cultures developed different myths about the afterlife. Egyptians crafted complex narratives about the weighing of the heart. Mesopotamians described a dreary land of no return. Anatolian peoples envisioned ancestral spirits lingering close to their families. These beliefs did not shape the underworld directly, but the souls arriving carried emotional frameworks influenced by their cultures. Persephone observed how these frameworks affected transitional states. Mortals increasingly sought meaning not through fear of death, but through reflection on life's purpose. These developments subtly influenced the way souls arrived, less frantic, more contemplative. Through all these changes, one truth remained constant. Myths and rituals did not govern the underworld, but they shaped how humanity approached death. Mortals told stories to manage uncertainty. They created rituals to honor loss. They imagined structures that mirrored their hopes and fears. And even though these interpretations differed from reality, they revealed humanity's effort to make sense of the most universal boundary. Hades and Persephone did not intervene in mortal beliefs. They observed them, recognizing that myth and ritual formed an essential part of the human experience, one that allowed mortals to meet death with dignity or understanding, rather than despair. The underworld itself remained unchanged in essence, but its relationship to the mortal imagination grew richer, layered with centuries of stories, ceremonies, and symbols. And as mortals continued shaping their understanding of death, the realm below quietly continued its work, receiving each life with the impartiality that had defined it since the earliest ages. The turning of empires. As the ancient world shifted from localized kingdoms into vast imperial networks, the underworld felt the tremors of change long before historians would give those eras names. Hades and Persephone were not influenced by politics, warfare, or cultural ambitions. Yet the consequences of those events flowed into their realm with unmistakable weight. Mortality was no longer shaped only by natural cycles, plagues, storms, harvests, but by systems built on conquest, administration, ideology, and commerce. Empires rose with staggering speed, spread across continents, and collapsed under their own expansion. Each transformation above created distinct waves of souls, emotional patterns, and psychological impressions that the underworld absorbed with calm precision. When the Roman Empire entered its apex, the number of souls arriving multiplied beyond anything earlier centuries had produced. Roman roads stretched from Britain to the Near East. Roman governors presided over regions once governed by local kings. Roman legions marched across deserts, rivers, and mountains. Mortals now tied their fates to systems that spanned continents. And when empires stretched themselves thin, consequences arrived in equal magnitude. Hades observed these patterns without intervention. His realm processed each wave methodically. Persephone monitored the emotional tones of arrivals, some shaped by a sense of duty fulfilled, others by frustration, others by the uncertainty of living at the mercy of systems too vast for individuals to influence. The Pax Romana brought long stretches of stability to vast regions. During these years, deaths still occurred from illness, accidents, and age. But the underworld felt a distinct calm. Souls arrived with impressions of structured communities, forums, baths, amphitheaters, marketplaces. They carried memories of shared civic ideals, local festivals, family lineage, and daily routines shaped by an empire that sought unity through order. But stability never lasted. As the empire expanded, so did its vulnerabilities. In the eastern provinces, revolts erupted periodically. In the west, distant tribes pushed against Roman frontiers. Trade networks introduced not only goods but pathogens. Massive populations gathered in cities whose sanitation systems struggled to support them. And as Rome's political system grew strained by corruption, succession crises, and internal conflict, the underworld felt the accelerating pace of mortality. One of the earliest signs of Rome's instability came during the Antonine Plague. Arriving perhaps on ships from the east, the illness spread rapidly through the empire, sweeping across cities and military camps alike. The underworld received souls by the thousands: soldiers who collapsed in their tents, merchants who succumbed during their travels, families struck with sudden fever. Lethe's currents had to adjust. Psychopomps increased in number along transitional paths. Persephone recommended new calming corridors for those whose final moments were marked by delirium. As the centuries progressed, the underworld observed shifts in Roman values through the impressions carried by the dead. Early Romans had emphasized discipline, duty, and stoic virtue. Later generations arrived with memories of luxurious banquets, political intrigue, and the pressures of social competition. These changes did not alter judgment but provided insights into the evolution of mortality's priorities. Persephone noted that souls burdened by ambition often required time in restorative chambers to release their attachments and adjust to the stillness of the underworld. When Rome fractured during the crisis of the 3rd century, the underworld felt the turmoil like shifting winds across the surface of the world. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. Civil wars erupted, borders collapsed, famine and plague struck repeatedly. Thousands of soldiers died in skirmishes that achieved little beyond shifting power temporarily. During these chaotic years, Tartarus received souls whose cruelty had escalated in times of collapsing order, while Elysium received soldiers who acted with courage despite the instability. Asphodel absorbed countless civilians caught amid the turmoil, farmers whose lands were seized, merchants whose routes were blocked, families whose homes burned. Their impressions reflected resignation more often than anger. Many had simply tried to survive forces beyond their control. Persephone studied these emotional tones closely. She recognized that collapses of political systems produced distinct patterns of grief, not merely fear. She recommended additional pathways near Lethe to accommodate those whose despair lingered. Hades implemented shifts to the underworld's internal geography to prevent crowding. As Rome recovered temporarily under stronger emperors and administrative reforms, the underworld sensed renewed stability. Souls arrived with memories of rebuilding, of restored trade, of renewed civic life. But these periods grew shorter as time progressed. The rise of Christianity reshaped the emotional framework of Roman souls. Mortals arrived with new beliefs about the afterlife, forgiveness, and divine judgment. They expected redemption or condemnation through frameworks unfamiliar in earlier centuries. While these beliefs did not alter the underworld's structure, they influenced transitional phases. Some souls sought clarity, others expected to meet divine figures beyond the judges. Persephone adapted the psychopomp's communication patterns to ensure that souls arrived at the proper places without confusion. The fall of Rome in the West produced one of the most dramatic waves of mortality the underworld had encountered. Hades observed the slow disintegration, cities shrinking, roads degrading, trade routes collapsing, kingdoms emerging where provinces once stood. The souls arriving reflected this fragmentation. Their impressions were less unified, shaped now by regional identities rather than imperial ones. Some carried memories of barbarian invasions, burning farms, sacked cities, collapsing walls. Others arrived with impressions of religious fervor, conflict, or the fear of divine punishment. Persephone identified unprecedented emotional diversity during this period. She recommended new zones in asphodel, designed to separate souls whose final moments were shaped by extreme fear from those whose deaths were peaceful. Hades expanded those regions subtly, maintaining the underworld's efficiency. As Rome transformed into a patchwork of successor kingdoms, the underworld adjusted to new cultural patterns. Greek and Latin souls were soon joined by those from Germanic tribes, Slavic communities, and migrating groups from Central Asia. Each carried distinct traditions, languages, and beliefs about death. The rise of the Byzantine Empire in the East maintained continuity for centuries, stabilizing souls arriving from the Mediterranean. But beyond its borders, new forces accelerated mortality in unprecedented patterns. When Islam spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe, the underworld saw a new emotional clarity in the souls arriving. Many Islamic mortals approached death with acceptance shaped by strong theological frameworks. Persephone noted reduced unrest among these arrivals. Their beliefs gave them a sense of order at life's end that eased transition. The underworld also absorbed souls from the vast empires of Central Asia. Steppe warriors arrived with impressions of horses, open plains, and clan loyalties. Their deaths in battle often carried no fear. Courage was ingrained in their culture. The judges evaluated their lives through the same impartial criteria applied to all mortals, but their impressions added new textures to the underworld's emotional landscape. The greatest shock to mortality in this era came with the rise of the Mongol Empire. From China to the Middle East to Eastern Europe, the Mongols reshaped civilizations through unparalleled military campaigns. Their speed, strategy, and scale produced enormous waves of death. Cities fell in days. Kingdoms disappeared. The underworld processed surges of souls unlike anything seen before. Hades implemented extensive procedural shifts. Thanatos required assistance from thousands of psychopomps to manage the sudden mass deaths. Persephone examined the emotional patterns closely, recognizing that many souls arrived with impressions of fear mixed with awe. Mongol conquests carried both destruction and rigid discipline. These mass arrivals, though overwhelming from a mortal perspective, became part of the underworld's operational routine. Hades and Persephone ensured no chaos occurred. Judgment remained steady, balance held firm. As Europe entered the Middle Ages, Christianity dominated its cultural landscape. Souls arrived expecting heaven, hell, or purgatory. Many feared the underworld due to theological reinterpretations that cast Hades as demonic, a misconception that did not alter the realm's structure but created emotional turbulence among the newly dead. Persephone adjusted transitional processes for these souls, ensuring they reached clarity without distress. In Asia, Buddhism and Hinduism shaped the beliefs of billions. Souls arrived with impressions of karma, rebirth, and liberation. These beliefs often eased fear at death, allowing smoother transitions. In Africa, ancestral veneration shaped impressions. Souls arrived with strong ties to lineage and family memory. Psychopomps adjusted their methods to help these souls release attachments gently. In the Americas, civilizations like the Maya, Aztec, and Inca developed intricate cosmologies. Souls arrived with expectations of layered afterlives, realms governed by their own deities, and rituals intended to guide their journey. Their impressions added new depth to asphodel's emotional texture. Even as beliefs varied, the underworld accommodated all arrivals with the same neutrality. When plagues ravaged medieval Europe, including the Black Death, the underworld processed mortality at a rate unmatched since the great ancient epidemics. Entire villages vanished, cities emptied, Fear swept through populations with a force that left deep impressions on the newly dead. Persephone oversaw the placement of additional calming zones. Lethe's waters surged to relieve the emotional burden. Hades ensured that the judges could process the immense influx without delay. Across Asia, dynasties rose and fell. Civil wars reshaped political landscapes. Souls arrived with impressions of shifting alliances, philosophical debates, and literary traditions that enriched their emotional profiles. Through all these changes, the underworld remained constant in function and structure. It expanded as needed, refined its internal architecture, and adapted to the shifting nature of mortality. Hades and Persephone did not measure time as mortals did. They perceived centuries as subtle transitions, each marked by distinct patterns in the souls arriving. The collapse of empires, the rise of faiths, the spread of cultures, and the tragedies of disease all flowed into the underworld in orderly succession. The underworld and the dawn of modernity. The ancient empires had risen and fallen, leaving behind layers of culture, belief, warfare, and philosophy that had shaped the flow of souls for millennia. Yet none of these eras prepared the underworld for what would follow. As humanity entered the age later called modernity, the mortal world shifted with unprecedented speed. Technology, commerce, exploration, faith, scientific inquiry, political transformation, and global conflict reshaped the patterns of life and, inevitably, the patterns of death. Hades and Persephone, whose reign had always adapted methodically to mortal developments, now faced changes far more rapid and sprawling than any age before. Modernity did not arrive in a single moment. Its beginnings stretched across centuries. New ideas emerged quietly at first in monasteries, trade cities, universities, and courts, before spreading outward at a pace that accelerated with each generation. The first great tremor of this new age came with the Renaissance, a rebirth of knowledge in the Mediterranean world. Souls from this period began arriving with impressions unlike those from the Middle Ages. They carried memories of scientific experiments, anatomical drawings, philosophical debates, and artistic visions that pushed the boundaries of mortal understanding. Their lives were shaped not only by religious doctrine but by curiosity, creativity, and a revived interest in the intellectual achievements of the ancient world. When these souls entered the underworld, Persephone examined the emotional tones they carried. Many came with a sense of accomplishment, having expanded human understanding. Others arrived weighed down by ambition, rivalry, or the political turbulence that accompanied new ideas. Hades observed an increase in the number of souls shaped by the pursuit of knowledge rather than by warfare or survival alone. This shift did not alter judgment but reflected the evolving nature of mortal purpose. As seafaring technology advanced, mortal explorers crossed oceans previously thought impassable. They reached continents unknown to their ancestors, connecting cultures separated by vast distances. This sudden expansion of human contact reshaped the world's demographics, economies, and social structures. For the underworld, the consequences were profound. Souls from newly contacted regions arrived, carrying impressions shaped by civilizations with long histories unknown to Greeks or Romans, societies with rich mythologies, complex rituals, and unique understandings of death. Indigenous peoples from the Americas, Australia, Polynesia, and sub-Saharan Africa now entered the underworld alongside souls from Europe and Asia. Their beliefs about the afterlife varied widely. Some expected to join ancestral spirits. Others believed their souls would journey through layered realms. A few imagined reunions with nature itself. These impressions influenced their initial states upon arrival, and Persephone adapted transitional pathways to ease the shift between their expectations and the underworld's reality. Exploration, however, brought devastating consequences. Disease swept through populations unprepared for foreign pathogens. Entire communities died within months. The underworld received staggering numbers of souls, their impressions filled with confusion, terror, and sudden loss. Souls from this era arrived with impressions of telescopes pointed toward the heavens, anatomical sketches that challenged superstition, and arguments about reason versus faith. Philosophers such as Descartes, Locke, and Kant arrived with minds accustomed to questioning reality itself. Their transitions were smooth. They carried little fear. They approached judgment with composure born from inquiry. Yet modernity was never a linear march toward enlightenment. As scientific discovery expanded, so too did political tension. Kingdoms transformed into nation-states, dynasties fell, revolutions shook continents, and with each upheaval, waves of souls descended into the underworld carrying impressions shaped by ambition, hope, violence, and uncertainty. The French Revolution brought one such wave. Souls from Paris to Marseille arrived with memories of tumbling monarchies, impassioned speeches, and the thunderous noise of crowds demanding new rights. Many had died, believing they were participating in the reshaping of civilization. Others perished under fear and chaos. Persephone examined their impressions carefully, noting how political idealism created emotional patterns unlike those of earlier eras. Hades responded by expanding restorative chambers for souls overwhelmed by ideological fervor. Though the underworld did not judge ideas, many of these mortals carried emotional residue that required calming before they approached the judges. As industrialization swept across Europe and North America, the nature of death shifted dramatically. Mortals no longer died solely from war or disease. Now they died in factories, mines, and crowded cities shaped by rapid urban expansion. Souls arrived with impressions of machinery, steel, smoke, and relentless labor. The underworld sensed a new kind of fatigue, one shaped by economic forces and social inequality. As scientific discovery expanded, so too did political tension. Kingdoms transformed into nation-states, dynasties fell, revolutions shook continents, and with each upheaval, waves of souls descended into the underworld carrying impressions shaped by ambition, hope, violence, and uncertainty. The French Revolution brought one such wave. Souls from Paris to Marseille arrived with memories of tumbling monarchies, impassioned speeches, and the thunderous noise of crowds demanding new rights. Psychopomps adapted communication styles, offering impressions suited to individuals with widely varying beliefs about the afterlife. Then came the age of global conflict. The First World War reshaped mortality on a scale unprecedented in human history. Millions died in trenches across Europe, carrying impressions of artillery, gas, mud, and mechanized destruction. Soldiers arrived with emotional tones of shock, confusion, and disillusionment. Hades implemented emergency measures to absorb these waves, expanding transitional corridors, reinforcing the judges' chambers, and coordinating additional support from river spirits like Acheron. Persephone studied how these souls clustered in emotional patterns shaped by trauma. She developed new methods to stabilize their states, using Lethe's calming influence more strategically. The underworld adapted swiftly, maintaining order despite the overwhelming influx. These impressions influenced their initial states upon arrival, and Persephone adapted transitional pathways to ease the shift between their expectations and the underworld's reality. Exploration, however, brought devastating consequences. Disease swept through populations unprepared for foreign pathogens. Entire communities died within months. The underworld received staggering numbers of souls, their impressions filled with confusion, terror, and sudden loss. Persephone devised new restorative sectors, quiet, neutral regions adjacent to Asphodel, designed for those whose final moments were marked by extreme distress. Hades supported these additions, recognizing their necessity. The judges adapted their deliberations for souls whose lives had unfolded under unprecedented moral complexity. After the war, the world above rebuilt itself with renewed energy. Technology accelerated faster than ever before. Medical advances extended lifespans. Nations formed alliances that shifted global power balances. Souls arrived with impressions of new inventions, airplanes, electricity, vaccines, telephones, and machinery that transformed daily life. For the first time, the underworld processed souls who had lived connected to people on distant continents through communication technologies. Their memories carried impressions of global awareness. They had witnessed news across oceans, participated in cultural exchanges, and understood humanity as an interconnected species rather than isolated civilizations. This shift influenced the emotional patterns of the dead. Persephone noticed that these souls arrived with less regional anxiety and more universal concerns. Their identities were shaped by shared global events rather than strictly local traditions. Hades recognized that such unity simplified some transitional processes while complicating others. As decades passed, the world above entered the digital age. Computers, satellites, and global networks transformed society again. Souls began arriving with memories of virtual communication, digital information, and lives that extended beyond physical boundaries. Some carried impressions of online communities that transcended regions. Others arrived burdened by the pressures of accelerated living. Persephone noted an increase in souls who carried emotional fragmentation, individuals overwhelmed by the pace of modern life. She expanded calming chambers and restructured transitional zones to help these souls disentangle their final impressions. The underworld also observed the rise of global disasters, pandemics, earthquakes, floods, famines, and conflicts shaped by modern weapons. The rise of the Assyrians brought waves of conquest that extended beyond their homeland. Their campaigns scattered communities, displaced populations, and caused surges of death not limited to soldiers. Civilians, merchants, and farmers found themselves caught in conflicts that spanned far more territory than earlier mortal societies had ever experienced. When these souls arrived, they brought impressions of brutality, innovation, ambition, and suffering. These impressions enriched the underworld's emotional landscape, offering balance to the tragedies. Throughout all of this, Hades remained constant. His rulership never shifted with human change. He processed each wave of souls with impartiality. He adapted structure without altering the underworld's essence. Persephone, too, maintained her steady presence. She examined modern souls with the same clear attention she had given those of ancient shepherds, warriors, and philosophers. But she recognized one significant truth. Modernity blurred traditional boundaries between life, memory, identity, and mortality. Souls arrived carrying emotional patterns shaped by global networks, not isolated communities. Their lives contained greater freedom and greater complexity. Their deaths reflected unprecedented choices and unprecedented burdens. The underworld evolved in response. It expanded not spatially but structurally. New restorative chambers addressed psychological fragmentation. Transitional corridors guided souls whose identities were shaped by rapid change. The judges refined their principles to address lives lived under systems that differed entirely from ancient frameworks. Through all of these transitions, Hades and Persephone remained unshaken. The underworld endured as it always had, steady, neutral, structured. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires conquered and collapsed. Technologies transformed the mortal world again and again. The underworld in the global age. Humanity entered an era that earlier centuries could never have imagined. The world became interconnected not by trade routes alone, nor by empires bound through conquest, but by instantaneous communication, shared crises, collective achievements, and a global awareness that awakened a new dimension of mortal identity. The underworld, ancient, steady, and impartial, felt these transformations as they unfolded across the surface. Souls no longer arrived shaped by isolated communities or regional histories. Now they carried impressions formed by a planet linked through wires, satellites, economies, migrations, ideologies, and information that traveled faster than any mortal body had ever moved. The shift began subtly. In the early years of the 20th century, long before global communication became universal, the seeds of this new era were already taking root. Aviation shrank distances. Radio brought distant voices into single rooms. Industrialization transformed nations into centers of manufacturing and innovation. These developments reshaped mortality in ways that mirrored the mechanical precision of the machines mortals created. Some carried impressions of opportunity, others carried the fatigue of relentless labor. Many arrived with identities shaped by societies in the midst of redefining themselves. The mid-20th century brought an acceleration unlike anything the Underworld had seen. After global wars reshaped international borders and ideologies, humanity turned toward reconstruction, diplomacy, and scientific exploration. Souls from this era carried impressions of hope mixed with exhaustion, of nations rebuilding their foundations while simultaneously preparing for new challenges. Technological innovation exploded. Computers emerged. Television spread images across continents. The first satellites pierced the upper atmosphere, sending signals between countries as easily as voices carried across a room. For the first time in history, mortals could witness events occurring on the opposite side of the world in real time. They watched wars, celebrations, discoveries, tragedies, and revolutions unfold from afar. When these mortals died, the Underworld processed souls shaped by a consciousness larger than previous ages, individuals whose perceptions extended beyond their immediate environments. Some carried impressions of opportunity, others carried the fatigue of relentless labor. Many arrived with identities shaped by societies in the midst of redefining themselves. The mid-20th century brought an acceleration unlike anything the Underworld had seen. After global wars reshaped international borders and ideologies, humanity turned toward reconstruction, diplomacy, and scientific exploration. The Underworld had to adjust accordingly. Hades created new transitional corridors designed for souls whose final impressions were shaped by overwhelming quantities of information, news, entertainment, global crises, and cultural movements that blended together in intricate patterns. Persephone recommended that Lethe's influence be calibrated differently for modern souls, ensuring that memories dissolved without destabilizing their identities. Modern minds carried more complexity, and their transitions required precision. As the late 20th century arrived, humanity experienced the birth of the digital age. Personal computers entered homes and offices. Data began flowing across continents with unprecedented speed. The emergence of the internet transformed communication, thought, creativity, and culture. Souls arrived with impressions of virtual worlds, online identities, and interactions that transcended physical boundaries. Mortals connected with strangers across oceans, shared experiences with communities they never met in person, and lived lives deeply intertwined with technology. These developments produced new emotional patterns. Some souls arrived with a sense of openness. Modern life had given them platforms to express themselves. Others arrived burdened by isolation. Despite global connectivity, many mortals felt lonely in ways earlier ages never experienced. Persephone examined these impressions and recognized that the digital world influenced mortality, not only in practical ways but in emotional ones. She advised the psychopomps to adapt their methods of guidance. Communication with new arrivals needed to account for identities shaped by virtual interactions, fragmented attention, and the pressures of comparison amplified by interconnected societies. New restorative chambers addressed psychological fragmentation. Transitional corridors guided souls whose identities were shaped by rapid change. The judges refined their principles to address lives lived under systems that differed entirely from ancient frameworks. Through all of these transitions, Hades and Persephone remained unshaken. The underworld endured as it always had, steady, neutral, structured. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires conquered and collapsed. In the early 21st century, humanity faced events that further altered the nature of mortality. Wars transformed from territorial conflicts into ideological ones. Economies linked through global trade meant that a crisis in one region affected lives across the world. Pandemics spread rapidly through international travel. Social movements rose and spread through digital platforms in days rather than centuries. Souls arriving in the underworld carried emotional tones shaped by these interconnected dynamics. Hades and Persephone monitored these developments with uncompromising steadiness. They did not respond with surprise. Gods did not experience such emotions, but with adjustment. The underworld's architecture shifted subtly. Lethe absorbed new layers of memory. Acheron processed collective grief on global scales. Elysium welcomed souls whose lives were shaped not by regional excellence, but by contributions that resonated across nations. Tartarus received individuals whose harm extended through systems and ideologies rather than isolated acts. One of the most notable changes in the modern era was the global blending of beliefs. Souls now arrived carrying concepts from multiple religions, philosophies, and secular frameworks. Some expected reincarnation, others anticipated a single judgment. Still others believed in heaven, hell, ancestral realms, or dissolution into cosmic consciousness. Persephone observed that these varied beliefs influenced the emotional readiness of souls. But the underworld accommodated all with consistency. Psychopomps offered impressions that calmed expectations without reinforcing or contradicting mortal doctrines. The judges evaluated lives based on conduct, not creed. Modern mortality also introduced new dilemmas. Medical advances extended life but raised questions about the boundaries between life and death. Souls sometimes arrived after prolonged periods of unconsciousness, carrying faint impressions shaped by machines and medical intervention. Persephone adjusted transitional pathways for these individuals, recognizing that their connections to life often lingered more strongly than those who died in earlier eras. Global infrastructure produced mass casualty events unlike anything ancient civilizations had faced. Plane crashes, industrial accidents, chemical disasters. Each event sent clusters of souls whose deaths occurred within seconds. Hades ensured that these surges were absorbed without disruption. Psychopomps guided these souls along calm corridors, preventing panic from influencing the underworld's pathways. The emotional complexity of modern mortality also required expansion of restorative regions. Persephone developed new chambers designed for souls whose final years had been marked by psychological strain, individuals burdened by loneliness, societal pressure, or disconnection despite living in a hyper-connected world. These souls needed additional time near Lethe, allowing layers of stress and confusion to dissolve gradually. The underworld also observed how modern mortals engaged with death in consciously secular ways. Funerals became varied. Traditional rites persisted, but new practices emerged. Cremations without elaborate ceremonies, digital memorials, celebrations of life, instead of mourning rituals. Souls arrived with impressions reflecting these shifts, though the underworld processed them no differently. Persephone noted that many modern mortals viewed death not through theological frameworks but through personal or emotional ones. This changed expectations, but not the structure of transition. At the same time, global spirituality blossomed. Mortals blended ancient mythologies, Eastern philosophies, and personal belief systems. They imagined the afterlife as energy, as memory, as ancestral presence. Some even envisioned the underworld in poetic terms, weaving Hades and Persephone into modern writings, films, and stories. These interpretations reached the underworld faintly, carried by memories of the newly dead. Persephone observed these echoes with calm curiosity. Hades regarded them neutrally, recognizing that mortal imagination had always shaped its own truths. The early 21st century also brought unprecedented global crises. Climate change altered landscapes, leading to destructive storms, rising seas, and displacement of entire communities. War shifted into new forms: cyber conflict, insurgency, civil breakdown. Political systems fractured. Information spread faster than understanding. Souls arriving in this era carried emotional impressions shaped by uncertainty, instability, and rapid transformation. Yet, amid these challenges, modern humanity also produced extraordinary resilience. Acts of global cooperation, humanitarian missions, scientific innovations, and cultural achievements carried emotional tones of hope. The underworld absorbed these impressions as seamlessly as it absorbed those shaped by fear. Persephone noted that modern souls often carried both hope and despair, in equal measure, a duality reflecting the world they had lived in. Hades refined the underworld's internal architecture to accommodate these emotional complexities. The underworld also observed how modern mortals engaged with death in consciously secular ways. Funerals became varied. Traditional rites persisted, but new practices emerged: cremations without elaborate ceremonies, digital memorials, celebrations of life, instead of mourning rituals. Souls arrived with impressions reflecting these shifts. Though the underworld processed them no differently, humanity's technological progress accelerated faster than any previous era. Souls arrived carrying impressions of digital overload, constant stimulation, and anxieties shaped by information access unprecedented in history. Persephone identified these patterns quickly and expanded calming practices throughout the underworld. Despite all these transformations, one truth remained unchanged. Every mortal life, no matter how deeply entangled in global systems or technologies, arrived in the underworld as a soul stripped of worldly illusions. Each entered with the essence of their lived experience, ready to be evaluated with impartiality. The global age had altered the surface of the world beyond recognition. Nations merged and fractured. Technology created miracles and catastrophes. Cultures blended. Climate change altered landscapes, leading to destructive storms, rising seas, and displacement of entire communities. War shifted into new forms: cyber conflict, insurgency, civil breakdown. Political systems fractured. Information spread faster than understanding. Souls arriving in this era carried emotional impressions shaped by uncertainty, instability, and rapid transformation. Yet, amid these challenges, modern humanity also produced extraordinary resilience. And as the global age continued unfolding above, the underworld remained what it had always been: a place where every story, no matter how complex, found its final clarity. The timeless throne. In the ages that mortals would one day call contemporary, an era defined not by centuries but by constant reinvention, the underworld continued its steady function beneath the shifting surface of the world. Nations rose and fractured. Technology accelerated. Human life extended. Cultures blended. Information moved with such speed that the mortal mind reshaped itself every generation. Yet through all of this, the underworld absorbed the consequences without disruption, maintaining the stability that the cosmos required. Hades did not measure time as mortals did. He did not see decades or centuries, but flows patterns in how humanity lived and died. He observed how global systems influenced the rate of death, how new causes emerged while old ones subsided, how human fears evolved with each generation. But none of these changes altered his nature. He remained the steady axis around which the final boundary turned. Persephone, who divided each year between the world above and the underworld below, perceived modernity through a dual lens. When she returned to the Earth's surface, she walked through landscapes reshaped by skyscrapers, highways, factories, farms, oceans traversed by ships larger than ancient cities, and skies crossed by aircraft that carried thousands across continents in hours. She observed the ways mortals cultivated crops through modern irrigation, genetic science, and machinery transformations unimaginable to the shepherds and farmers of ancient Greece. In the early 21st century, humanity faced events that further altered the nature of mortality. Wars transformed from territorial conflicts into ideological ones. Economies linked through global trade meant that a crisis in one region affected lives across the world. Pandemics spread rapidly through international travel. Social movements rose and spread through digital platforms in days rather than centuries. Mortals lived faster now. Their lives contained more complexity. Their identities often fractured across competing obligations. Their deaths reflected these patterns. The underworld, though timeless, adapted to each new age. In the early 21st century, mortals faced crises shaped by global interconnectedness. Pandemics that spread across continents in weeks, economic collapses that affected millions simultaneously, conflicts broadcast in real time, natural disasters amplified by climate change. Souls arrived carrying layered fears: fear for their families, fear for the future, fear defined not by myth or superstition, but by information overload and uncertainty. Persephone identified these emotional states with precise attention. She recognized that many modern souls required early stabilization. Some had spent their final years immersed in anxieties shaped by technology, constant news cycles, social pressures, virtual identities. Others had died suddenly, overwhelmed by disasters broadcast across screens worldwide. These souls required gentler guidance from psychopomps, longer periods near Lethe, and more time in transitional zones before judgment. But there were also souls whose final moments reflected the triumphs of modern humanity. Doctors who saved lives during global crises, scientists who expanded knowledge, teachers who shaped minds, artists who connected people through creativity, leaders who fostered peace. These souls arrived with impressions of dedication, compassion, and perseverance. Elysium gained new residents who embodied virtues expressed not in ancient heroics, but in everyday resilience. Hades maintained steady oversight through it all. His rulership never involved emotion, favoritism, or opinion. He reviewed reports from river spirits, monitored the judges, ensured that transitions remained orderly, and refined pathways when necessary. He did not interfere with mortal life or attempt to influence events above. He governed consequence, not cause. Persephone's presence offered balance, an understanding of cycles shaped by constant change above ground. When she returned each year, she noted how mortality had shifted during her absence. New technologies, new crises, new cultural phenomena. Though these observations did not alter her essence, they informed her understanding of the emotional textures carried by modern souls. The underworld's geography remained the same in structure but not in function. Asphodel accommodated souls whose lives had been shaped by complexity, yet without dramatic moral extremes. When she returned each year, she noted how mortality had shifted during her absence. New technologies, new crises, new cultural phenomena. Though these observations did not alter her essence, they informed her understanding of the emotional textures carried by modern souls. The underworld's geography remained the same in structure but not in function. Asphodel accommodated souls whose lives had been shaped by complexity, yet without dramatic moral extremes. Hades maintained steady oversight through it all. His rulership never involved emotion, favoritism, or opinion. He reviewed reports from river spirits, monitored the judges, ensured that transitions remained orderly, and refined pathways when necessary. He did not interfere with mortal life or attempt to influence events above. He governed consequence, not cause. Persephone's presence offered balance, an understanding of cycles shaped by constant change above ground. these new residents did not arrive with the heroic narratives of ancient myth. Their lives were quieter, but their impact profound. Tartarus remained as it had always been, a chamber of consequence for those whose actions had inflicted extreme harm. In modern times, such individuals often carried memories of systemic cruelty rather than personal violence, crimes executed through political oppression, exploitation, or power misused on a global scale. In modern ages, they responded to violations of cosmic order that manifested through the machinery of states or institutions as often as through individual actions. Their interventions remained rare but decisive. Cerberus still guarded the threshold with unwavering vigilance. Even after millennia, his three heads remained alert to the slightest disturbance, one watching the entrance, one listening for unnatural movement, one sensing shifts in the air. Though mortals rarely attempted to enter the underworld alive in modern times, Cerberus's presence held symbolic weight, grounding the realm in its ancient identity. Hades and Persephone ruled side by side, each contributing to the underworld's stability in their own way. Hades provided structure that did not change. Persephone provided insight shaped by cycles, transitions, and the constant evolution of mortal existence. When she returned to the Earth's surface, she walked through landscapes reshaped by skyscrapers, highways, factories, farms, oceans traversed by ships larger than ancient cities, and skies crossed by aircraft that carried thousands across continents in hours. She observed the ways mortals cultivated crops through modern irrigation, genetic science, and machinery transformations unimaginable to the shepherds and farmers of ancient Greece. Yet even as mortality changed, the underworld remained steady. The oldest souls still walked the meadows, figures from the earliest villages, from forgotten empires, from extinct cultures. They wandered quietly, unaffected by the complexity of modern souls. New arrivals sometimes asked them questions through faint impressions. Old souls responded with wisdom shaped by simplicity, bridging eras through silent understanding. In Elysium, ancient heroes occasionally observed modern thinkers, marveling at inventions that had reshaped the world above. Philosophers from Athens spoke with scientists from modern laboratories through impressions rather than words. Artists from Renaissance Italy shared space with musicians from contemporary cities, each contributing to the realm's quiet harmony. Persephone walked among these meadows at times, observing interactions across centuries. She saw how souls adapted to coexistence, how identities softened, how memories dissolved peacefully, how ancient and modern embraced the same stillness. Hades watched from his throne unchanged, austere, steady. His gaze missed nothing. He understood that mortality's variations, however dramatic, always resolved into the same endpoint: a soul standing before judgment, stripped of illusions, carrying only the truth of their existence. As the global age continued, mortals speculated increasingly about the afterlife. They imagined simulations, digital consciousness, immortality through technology. None of these altered the underworld. When death came, the soul arrived unburdened by human attempts to escape it. Digital memories did not cross the boundary. Neural interfaces did not preserve consciousness beyond the body. Only the essence of the individual entered the underworld, untouched by technology. The mortal world may one day reach distant planets, build cities on the moon, or send machines into the deepest stretches of the cosmos. But no matter where mortals travel physically, their souls will always return along the same ancient paths, descending through the silent corridors into the realm where rivers whisper, where judges sit, where balance is maintained. Hades will still be there. Persephone will still return each year. As the global age continued, mortals speculated increasingly about the afterlife. They imagined simulations, digital consciousness, immortality through technology. None of these altered the underworld. When death came, the soul arrived unburdened by human attempts to escape it. Digital memories did not cross the boundary. Neural interfaces did not preserve consciousness beyond the body. Only the essence of the individual entered the underworld, untouched by technology.